Before the age of cameras, before the age of records, before anyone thought to ask questions, things happened out there. In the dust, the silence, and the vast open nothing of the American frontier. Things that were witnessed, whispered about, and then buried. Disappearances with no tracks. Gunfighters who seemed impossible to kill. Towns that vanished overnight. Crimes that were never solved. Because they couldn't be. The Wild West wasn't just lawless. It was unknowable. So sit back, relax, dim the lights if you dare, and let's ride in. Deep in the Salt River Canyon of central Arizona, where the cliffs rise like cathedral walls and the desert wind moves through the gorges in low, mournful sighs, there is a cave. It doesn't announce itself. It sits in the rock face, quiet and shadowed, the way secrets tend to sit, patient, unassuming, waiting. It is called Skeleton Cave. And in the winter of 1872, something happened inside it that the historical record has never fully explained. The broad outline is documented. On December 28, 1872, U.S. Army forces under the command of Major William Brown pursued a band of Yavapai and Apache people into the depths of Salt River Canyon. The people, men, women, and children, had taken refuge in a cave high in the canyon wall, likely believing the elevation and the rock would protect them. It had before. It didn't this time. Brown soldiers, rather than advancing directly into the cave entrance, climbed to the ridge above it. From there, they fired down at an angle, using the cave's own ceiling to ricochet bullets into the people sheltering below. When the shooting stopped, somewhere between 75 and 110 people were dead. The cave floor was covered in the remains that gave it its name. The Army called it a victory. Newspapers called it decisive, and history for a long time called it a footnote. But here is where the record grows thin. Among those present that day, estimates suggest that a small number of survivors escaped, slipping through the chaos, through rock passages, through the terrible confusion of smoke and noise and grief. Some accounts place the number at fewer than 20. Others suggest more. The Army's own reports are inconsistent, which was not unusual for frontier engagements where counting the living mattered less than counting the dead. So where did the survivors go? This is not a trivial question. These were people with knowledge of the canyon, of the surrounding terrain, of what had just been done to their families. They carried with them the memory of that day in a way no written record ever could. And yet their voices are almost entirely absent from what followed. Historians point to obvious and painful reasons. Indigenous oral histories were systematically suppressed in the decades after the Indian Wars. Survivors who integrated into reservation communities often found that speaking about massacres invited punishment, dismissal, or worse. The mechanisms of erasure were not accidental. They were policy. But some researchers have noted something more specific and harder to explain. In the years following Skeleton Cave, several attempts were made by ethnographers and later by oral historians to document the event from the Yavapai perspective. What they found was not silence exactly, but incompleteness. Fragments that suggested a larger story existed somewhere, passed down through specific family lines, possibly deliberately withheld from outside collectors. Was this protective? Almost certainly, in part. Communities that had survived systematic violence had every reason to guard what remained. But some accounts hint at more, at details surrounding that day that diverge significantly from the Army's version, not in the death toll, which no one disputes, but in what preceded the cave, in why that specific location was chosen, in who exactly was there. The canyon keeps its own record, of course. The rock does not forget. And in the silence between the documented facts and the missing testimonies, something waits. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but present. A story that was never fully told, and the question that lingers, quietly, like the wind through those ancient walls. Was that silence chosen? Or was it forced upon them? Some stories are buried in rock and silence. Others are buried in the kind of forgetting that only happens when too many people are told, too many times, that what they saw wasn't real. The story of Skeleton Cave is one kind of erasure. What comes next is another. Quieter, older, and in some ways, even harder to trace. Because sometimes what gets lost isn't a people or a testimony. Sometimes what gets lost is the ground itself. There is a river in central Texas that moves slowly, the way old things move, without urgency, without apology. The San Saba River winds through the Edwards Plateau, through limestone hills and cedar breaks, through country that feels ancient in a way that's difficult to explain. The land here doesn't demand your attention. It simply holds it. And somewhere beneath it, or beside it, or perhaps beneath the hills that watch over it, there may be silver. Not metaphorical silver, not legend silver. Silver in the earth, in veins, in quantities that men have killed for and died for and lost their minds searching for across more than 2.5 centuries. The story of the lost San Saba mines is one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in American history. And like all the best mysteries, it begins not with a question, but with a claim. In the mid-1700s, Spanish missionaries and soldiers operating out of New Spain began receiving reports from indigenous guides and traders about rich silver deposits somewhere in the hill country of what is now central Texas. The Lipan Apache, who knew this land intimately, spoke of silver-bearing rock near the San Saba River. The Spanish, whose entire colonial enterprise in the Americas had been built on extracted precious metals, listened carefully. In 1757, a mission was established near the San Saba, the mission Santa Cruz de San Saba, partly as a religious outpost, partly as a strategic foothold in territory the Spanish hoped to exploit. The following year, the mission was destroyed in a raid by Comanche and Allied forces, and the priests who ran it were killed. The Spanish retaliated, and the region descended into a cycle of violence that made sustained exploration nearly impossible. But the reports of silver didn't stop. Through the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, a series of Spanish expeditions attempted to locate the deposits. Some returned with fragments of ore, some returned with maps, rough, hand-drawn, deeply unreliable by modern standards. Some didn't return at all. The most famous of these early accounts involves a man named Jim Bowie, yes, that Jim Bowie, of Alamo fame, who led an expedition into the San Saba region in 1831 with a party of men, reportedly following a map of Spanish origin. What happened on that expedition has been debated ever since. Bowie and his men were attacked near the San Saba River by a large force, later estimated at over 100 warriors. The battle, known as Calf Creek or the San Saba Fight, was fierce enough that it passed into frontier legend almost immediately. Bowie's party survived. Barely. And what they found, or didn't find, before the attack has never been fully established. Bowie himself spoke of the mines, vaguely and inconsistently, in the years before his death at the Alamo in 1836. He neither confirmed finding silver nor denied it. He simply left the question open, the way a man does when the answer is either too valuable or too painful to speak plainly. Here's where the verified history ends and the harder questions begin. The Spanish colonial records that survive, and many don't, lost to fire, flood, and institutional neglect, describe something more organized than a rumor. There are references to actual extraction, to processed ore, to the existence of mine shafts that were deliberately concealed when the political situation in the region became untenable. Some researchers have interpreted this as evidence that the mines were real, productive, and intentionally hidden rather than simply never found. Others argue the deposits were always modest, more promise than substance, inflated by the desperation of men far from home who needed to justify their presence in dangerous territory. But then, there are the maps. Over the decades, an unusual number of hand-drawn maps purporting to show the location of the San Saba silver have surfaced. Some attributed to Spanish sources, some to later Anglo settlers, some to unnamed intermediaries. The maps don't agree with each other. Some point to the riverbanks. Some point to caves in the limestone hills. Some reference landmarks that no longer exist or that have never been identified. What is strange is not that the maps exist. Lost treasure maps are a genre unto themselves, and most are fraudulent. What is strange is the consistency of certain details across maps that could not plausibly have shared a common source. Specific geographical features, specific directional relationships, described in language that suggests actual observation rather than invention. Geologists who have surveyed the region confirm that the Edwards Plateau limestone is not, in principle, incompatible with silver-bearing mineral deposits. The geology doesn't prove the mines exist, but it doesn't rule them out either, and so the searches have continued, quietly, persistently, generation after generation. Local ranchers have found odd stonework in the hills, cut rock that doesn't match any known Native American or Anglo construction style. Amateur historians have cataloged dozens of reported sightings of tunnel entrances that later proved impossible to relocate. A handful of small silver samples have been recovered from the region over the years, their origins inconclusive. None of it proves anything. All of it suggests something. The Saba River moves on, indifferent to the questions it has outlasted. The limestone hills keep whatever they keep, and somewhere in the gap between the Spanish records and the empty hills, between Bowie's silence and the maps that don't quite align, the question remains. Not just whether the silver exists, but whether the people who knew its location made a deliberate choice in a moment of violence and upheaval to make sure certain things stayed hidden. And if they did, what else did they bury alongside it? There is a pattern, if you look long enough. A place, a secret, violence, and then silence. The particular kind of silence that follows when the people who knew the most are no longer able to speak. The San Saba Hills kept their silver, if they ever had it, behind a wall of raids and retreats and carefully lost records. What we'll look at next is different in its details, but recognizable in its shape, because the frontier had a way of turning knowledge into a liability. And in Johnson Canyon, that liability had a body count. Johnson Canyon cuts through the high desert of southern Utah, not far from the Arizona border, in country that still feels genuinely remote, even by modern standards. The canyon walls are red and ochre, and occasionally a deep bruised purple, depending on the light and the hour. Juniper and pinyon pine cling to the upper ridges. The floor of the canyon is dry most of the year, crossed by a wash that fills only when the storms come down from the mountains. It is beautiful in the way that indifferent places are beautiful. It does not care that you are there. It did not care either about what happened there in the 1870s and 1880s, a series of deaths, disappearances, and unanswered questions that have never been fully resolved. The story, as best as it can be reconstructed, begins with outlaws. The canyon country of southern Utah was, during the latter half of the 19th century, a genuine refuge for men operating outside the law. The terrain was labyrinthine, the population sparse, and the distance from any territorial authority considerable. Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch would later use this general region as a corridor and hiding ground. But before them, less famous men moved through these canyons with horses and cattle, and, according to persistent local accounts, something else entirely. Stolen gold and silver, accumulated through a combination of robbery, claim jumping, and the kind of frontier commerce that didn't leave receipts. Johnson Canyon, specifically, appears in several independent accounts from the period as a place where at least one significant cache of valuables was hidden. The accounts don't agree on everything. They agree on enough. What the historical record does document, thinly but consistently, is a series of violent deaths connected to the canyon and its surroundings during this period. Men who were known to have knowledge of the cache, or who were rumored to, died in ways that the frontier tended to absorb without much investigation. A shooting here, a disappearance there. Men who rode into the canyon and didn't come back, their absence recorded only in the memories of those who waited for them. This was not unusual for the time and place. Violence on the frontier was common, record-keeping was poor, and the line between an accident and a murder was often a matter of who was left to tell the story. But here is what makes Johnson Canyon different from a dozen similar tales. In the early 20th century, long after the immediate danger had presumably passed, people were still dying or disappearing in connection with the canyon's supposed treasure. A pattern emerged that several local historians have noted independently of one another. Individuals who announced publicly or semi-publicly that they had found evidence of the cache, or that they were close to locating it, had a tendency to meet bad ends before they could follow through. Not every one of them, but enough that the pattern became part of the canyon's reputation. Was this coincidence? The frontier was dangerous, and treasure hunters as a class tend to take risks that careful people don't. A man wandering remote canyon country alone, distracted by the possibility of wealth, is a man who might easily fall or get lost or make enemies he doesn't see coming. But some of the deaths were harder to explain away than that. There are accounts, reported by local residents, recorded by amateur historians, mentioned in the margins of regional newspapers, of men found dead in or near the canyon under circumstances that didn't fit accident or ordinary violence. Positioned strangely, missing equipment that should have been present. In one reported case, a man found dead with a partial map on his person, the relevant section carefully removed. Carefully. That word does a great deal of work in these accounts. It suggests agency. It suggests someone who knew what they were looking for and took the time to find it before or after the killing. Who that someone might have been is where the speculation begins, and where the evidence, frustratingly, runs thin. Some researchers point to organized criminal networks operating in the canyon country, successor groups to the original outlaws who had hidden the cache, with both a motive and a capacity for sustained violence to protect their secret. Others suggest something more opportunistic, independent actors who had partial knowledge of the treasure's location and were eliminating competition rather than protecting a legacy. There is a third possibility that some local historians raise quietly, and that deserves mention without overstatement. Several of the deaths connected to Johnson Canyon occurred during periods when land ownership in the region was contested, when federal surveys, railroad interests, and individual claims were colliding in ways that made certain knowledge, including knowledge of what lay hidden in specific canyon walls, genuinely valuable to powerful parties. In that reading, the treasure itself may have been secondary. What mattered was controlling who knew about it and who didn't. The canyon is still there. The walls still hold their color in the afternoon light, red fading to shadow as the sun drops behind the western ridge. Whatever is hidden in that country, if anything is, has now survived long enough that the people who killed to protect it are themselves long dead. But the question that the canyon keeps returning, quietly, in the way that places with long memories do, is whether the secret outlasted them, or whether it's still being kept. There is something the frontier kept doing, across different territories, different decades, different casts of characters. It kept producing secrets that nobody survived long enough to fully explain. In Johnson Canyon, the secret was collective. Multiple people, multiple deaths, a pattern that stretched across years. What comes next is different. It is the story of a single man. A man who chose solitude so completely, so deliberately, that when he finally disappeared, almost no one knew enough about him to ask the right questions. And the ones who did ask found that the answers had a way of not arriving. The Gila River moves through some of the most inhospitable country in the American Southwest. It cuts through Arizona in long, winding stretches, through desert that in the summer months becomes genuinely lethal, heat that doesn't break at night, terrain that disorients even experienced travelers, a landscape that seems, at times, almost purposefully unwelcoming. The cottonwoods along the riverbanks offer shade and occasional beauty, but the surrounding country is scrub and rock and silence. It was into this silence that a man came sometime in the 1870s and stayed. His name, depending on which account you consult, was either never known or deliberately withheld. He is referred to in the surviving record simply as the Hermit of the Gila, a figure who appeared in the river country with no clear origin story, built himself a rough dwelling in a location that discouraged visitors, and proceeded to live alone in the desert for years, possibly decades, with a consistency of purpose that struck everyone who encountered him as something beyond ordinary reclusiveness. This was the frontier. Solitary men were not uncommon. Men who preferred the wilderness to the company of settlements had their own recognizable type, and the Southwest had more than its share of them. Prospectors, drifters, men running from something, or simply running. But the Hermit of the Gila was, by multiple independent accounts, something different. He was not poor. This is the detail that threads through every account of him, mentioned almost in passing, as though the people recording it weren't quite sure what to do with it. He occasionally came into nearby settlements for supplies, and when he did, he paid in gold. Not nuggets, not dust, coin and refined metal, in quantities that suggested access to something more than casual prospecting. He didn't speak about where it came from. When asked, he deflected, or said nothing, or left. And then he would walk back into the desert and disappear for another stretch of months. The verified historical record on the Hermit is, predictably, thin. He appears in a handful of territorial newspaper mentions, in the recollections of a few settlers recorded years after the fact, and in the notes of at least one army officer who encountered him during a survey expedition and found him uncooperative in the particular way of men who have made a private decision about what they will and will not share with the world. What the record does not contain is any explanation of his origins, his wealth, or what ultimately became of him. At some point, the date unclear, the circumstances unknown, he stopped appearing in the settlements. The rough dwelling he had built was found eventually by travelers passing through. It was empty. His few possessions were present, which argued against a planned departure. What was absent was anything that might have explained who he was. No papers, no letters, no documents of any kind. Either he had nothing, or he had taken it with him, or someone else had. Here is where the accounts begin to diverge, and where the more speculative threads of the story emerge. Among the settlers and prospectors who knew the Hermit by reputation, a persistent belief circulated that his gold came from a specific source, a deposit somewhere in the Gila country that he had located and was quietly, systematically working alone. This was not considered impossible. The mineral geology of the region was known to be complex and promising, and stories of small private strikes that never made it into the official record were a staple of frontier life. But some accounts suggested something older and more complicated. There were those who believed the Hermit had not found a new deposit at all, that he had instead located, or been led to, a source of pre-existing extraction. Spanish workings, possibly, of the kind that dotted the Southwest in various states of concealment, worked and then abandoned during the colonial period when supply lines collapsed and the missions fell. Or something older still. Indigenous mining activity that the Spanish themselves had followed, working deposits that had been known and used long before Europeans arrived in the region. In this version of the story, the Hermit's silence was not eccentricity. It was strategy. A man who had found something genuinely valuable in country where the law was thin and the population was armed, had every practical reason to tell no one, trust no one, and maintain the kind of isolation that made him impossible to follow and difficult to rob. It may have worked. For a while. The fact that his possessions were found undisturbed, but he was not, suggests either a voluntary disappearance so complete it amounted to a kind of vanishing, or something else. Something that happened quickly enough that he couldn't take his things with him, and thoroughly enough that he was never found. No body was ever recovered. No claim was ever filed. No name was ever confirmed. The Gila moves on through its desert, brown and unhurried, indifferent to the questions left on its banks. The rock formations along its course hold their shapes against the sky, unchanged across the decades, carrying whatever they carry in the silence beneath them. A man came out of nowhere, lived richly in the middle of nothing, and then ceased. The only question the desert left behind is the one it always leaves. Where did it come from? And where did it go? The frontier had a way of consuming people, not always violently, not always suddenly. Sometimes it was gradual, a slow erasure, a man walking into the desert or the river country or the canyon shadows and simply not returning. The Hermit of the Gila is one version of that story. A man who chose disappearance, or had it chosen for him, and left behind nothing but questions and a thinning trail of gold. But not every disappearance was solitary. Not every erasure was quiet. Sometimes men vanished in groups, in uniform, under orders, and even then, the desert kept its silence. Fort Craig sits in the middle of the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, on a broad, flat plain that offers almost no natural shelter and almost no shade. The Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, begins just to the east, a 90-mile waterless stretch of desert that was, for centuries, one of the most feared passages in North America. The fort itself was established in 1854, built of adobe and determination in equal measure, and it occupied a strategic position on the road between El Paso and Santa Fe that made it one of the most important military installations in the pre-Civil War Southwest. It has been a ruin for over a century now. The adobe walls have softened back toward the earth they came from, rounded by rain and wind into shapes that look almost geological, as though the fort were something that grew here rather than something built. Walking through what remains, it is easy to forget that this was once a place of considerable activity. Hundreds of soldiers, supply wagons, the full machinery of territorial military presence. And it is easy to forget that some of those soldiers never left. Not in the way that was recorded anyway. The documented history of Fort Craig is substantial. It played a significant role in the Civil War Battle of Valverde in 1862, when Confederate forces under General Henry Sibley attempted to move up the Rio Grande and were met by Union troops, including, notably, some of the Buffalo Soldiers, who would become legendary in the post-war Southwest. The battle was costly and complicated, and its aftermath left the region in a state of prolonged instability that lasted well into the following years. But the disappearances that attach themselves to Fort Craig's history are not, for the most part, battlefield deaths. They are something more ambiguous. Through the 1860s and 1870s, the fort's records, which survive in fragmentary form in the National Archives, document a pattern of soldier disappearances that exceeds what the official explanations fully account for. Desertion was common on the frontier, and the Army's standard response to an absent soldier was to mark him as a deserter and move on. The paperwork was clean, the problem was resolved, and no further investigation was required. But desertion from Fort Craig carried a specific practical problem that the records don't adequately address. Where do you go? The fort was surrounded in every direction by some of the most inhospitable terrain in North America. To the east, the Jornada del Muerto. To the west, the Black Range, a rugged and largely unmapped mountain wilderness. To the north and south, a river valley that offered travel routes, but also offered very little cover from pursuit. A soldier deserting from Fort Craig was not stepping into freedom. He was stepping into a landscape that killed people with casual regularity. Some deserters made it, presumably. Men with horses, with water, with knowledge of the terrain. But the numbers in the Fort Craig record suggest more disappearances than successful desertions can reasonably explain. Men who vanished without their horses, men who vanished without their gear, men who were seen at the fort in the evening and were simply not present at morning roll call, with no witness to any departure. Here is where the mainstream explanation, desertion, begins to strain under the weight of the specifics. Several of the disappearances cluster around particular periods and particular locations. A disproportionate number of the missing soldiers were last seen in or near the section of the fort that bordered the river, the acequia system, the irrigation channels that brought water from the Rio Grande to the fort's interior. This detail appears in the records without comment, noted as a geographical fact and nothing more. But local accounts, gathered from the Hispanic communities that lived in the valley and had their own long memory of the fort and its surroundings, tell a different story about that stretch of river. The accounts vary in their specifics, as oral histories do, but they converge on a consistent suggestion that the land between the fort and the river, in a particular stretch to the south, was considered dangerous in a way that went beyond the ordinary dangers of frontier life. People avoided it after dark. Animals behaved strangely near it, and over the years, long before the fort was established and long after it fell into ruin, people who spent time there reported experiences that they struggled to describe in ordinary language. What those experiences were, and whether they have any connection to the missing soldiers, is a question that cannot be answered with the available evidence. What can be said is this: the Rio Grande Valley has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. The Jornada del Muerto was named for real deaths accumulated over real centuries. The land around Fort Craig has absorbed more history, more violence, more human passage than most places in North America can claim. Whether that history leaves something behind, some residue, some presence, some pattern that the living occasionally brush against without understanding, is a question that sits at the edge of what history can address. The adobe walls soften further every year, the river moves past without comment, and the names in the fort's records, the ones marked deserter, the ones with no further notation, remain exactly where they were left, unanswered, unresolved. Still waiting in some sense for someone to ask what actually happened to them. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds the stories of people who had every reason not to trust the world with their secrets. The soldiers of Fort Craig disappeared into a silence that the army created. Bureaucratic, institutional, the silence of a record that closes a file and asks no further questions. It was a silence imposed from above by systems that found it convenient. What comes next is a different kind of silence. Older, harder, built not by institution but by necessity, by a people who had learned, across generations and across continents, that what you reveal can be taken from you, and that what you conceal might be the only thing that keeps you alive. The brush country of southern Texas doesn't announce its history. It sits low and dense and thorned, a landscape of mesquite and prickly pear and dry creek beds that fill without warning when the rains come off the Gulf. The sky here is enormous, the horizon flat in every direction, and the land has a quality of watchfulness that is difficult to explain, but easy to feel. It is country that kept secrets well. It was chosen in part for exactly that reason. The Black Seminoles came to this country through one of the most remarkable journeys in American history, a journey that most Americans have never heard of, which is itself a kind of answer to why their secrets remained secret for so long. They began as a people formed in the borderlands of colonial Florida, free black men and women, escaped slaves, and Seminole Nation members who had built communities together in the swamps and hammocks of a territory that resisted American control longer than almost anywhere else on the continent. They fought alongside the Seminole in 3 separate wars against the United States. They survived removal. They crossed into Mexico in 1850, leading a column of several hundred people through Texas, hostile, slave-catching Texas, in a crossing that should not have succeeded, and somehow did. In Mexico, they were given land in exchange for military service, and they served with distinction, guarding the border against Apache and Comanche raids. Some later returned to Texas as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, serving the U.S. Army with a combat record that earned 4 Medal of Honor recipients, a remarkable figure for a unit of their size. This is the documented history. It is extraordinary on its own terms. But running alongside it, in the oral traditions of the Black Seminole communities that persist to this day in Brackettville, Texas, and in Nacimiento, Mexico, is another thread. A thread about gold. The accounts vary, as they always do in their particulars, but the consistent shape of the story is this, that during the long years of movement, of war, of crossing and recrossing dangerous territory, the Black Seminoles accumulated wealth. Not the wealth of comfort or display, but the functional wealth of a people who understood that paper money could be confiscated, that land could be taken, that the only store of value that traveled with you and couldn't be easily seized was metal that you carried or buried yourself. Gold, specifically, in quantities that the community's official economic history cannot account for. Where it came from is the first question, and the one with the most possible answers. Some researchers point to the Florida years, to raids and recoveries during the Seminole Wars, to the complex economy of a borderland community that traded with Spanish merchants, British agents, and anyone else who offered fair dealing. Others point to Mexico, where the Black Seminoles served in capacities that gave them access to territory and to information about that territory that most people didn't have. There is a third possibility, quieter and more specific, that appears in some accounts. During their crossing of Texas in 1850, a crossing made in haste, under threat, through country they were learning as they moved through it, the Black Seminoles reportedly passed through areas of southern Texas and northern Mexico where older workings existed, Spanish colonial mines, abandoned or obscured. In this version, the gold was not brought into the territory. It was found there by people skilled enough and desperate enough to recognize what they were looking at and experienced enough to know not to speak of it to anyone outside the community. What happened to this gold, if it existed in the quantities the oral tradition suggests, is the deeper mystery. The Black Seminole communities endured decades of broken promises from the U.S. government. Land grants were denied. Citizenship was contested. Veterans of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts died in poverty on land they had been promised and never received. If there was a cache, a reserve, a hidden store of wealth accumulated across those years of service and betrayal, the fact that it never surfaced publicly is not difficult to understand. A community that had been systematically dispossessed had every reason to maintain a financial reserve that existed entirely outside official knowledge, and every reason to ensure that knowledge of it passed only through trusted channels, in language that outsiders couldn't easily interpret. Some community members, speaking carefully to researchers over the years, have acknowledged that certain knowledge exists within families, knowledge that is not shared broadly, that is considered private in a way that goes beyond ordinary privacy. They do not describe this as treasure in the romantic sense. They describe it as something that belongs to the community, held in trust, protected because everything else was taken. Whether that something is physical, financial, or purely historical is a question they have not answered publicly. The brush country holds its shapes in the late afternoon light, mesquite throwing long shadows across the pale soil. The creek beds wait for rain. And in the families that carry this history, in the careful silences between what is said and what is not, the question of what was preserved, and where, and whether it still waits somewhere in that thorned and watchful landscape, remains for now entirely their own. There are stories that belong to the people who live them, stories held in careful silence, passed through family lines, protected because the alternative, exposure, extraction, dispossession, had already happened once, and the memory of it was still raw. The Black Seminoles understood that better than most. What they chose to keep, they kept completely. And that completeness, that disciplined privacy, is its own kind of answer to every question the outside world has tried to ask. But there are other silences on this frontier, silences that weren't chosen, silences left behind not by the living, but by the dead. And sometimes the dead leave evidence. The Hembrillo Basin sits inside the San Andres Mountains of southern New Mexico, in a stretch of country that has been restricted from public access for decades, absorbed into the White Sands Missile Range, sealed behind federal boundaries, left largely undisturbed in a way that almost nowhere else in the American Southwest has been. The basin itself is a high desert bowl, ringed by ridgelines that catch the morning light in shades of gold and rust, floored with creosote and yucca and the kind of stony soil that preserves things. The silence here is not peaceful exactly. It is the silence of a place that has been set apart, deliberately, from the ordinary movement of people and time, which makes what has been found there all the more difficult to explain. The documented history of Hembrillo Basin centers on a single significant event. In April of 1880, Apache forces under the leadership of Victorio, one of the most tactically gifted commanders of the entire Apache Wars period, engaged U.S. Army troops in the Basin in what became known as the Battle of Hembrillo Basin. The fight was fierce, inconclusive in the way that many engagements of the Apache Wars were inconclusive, and it left dead on both sides. Victorio's band withdrew. The Army declared a qualified success. The Basin returned to silence. That much is recorded. That much is agreed upon. What is less agreed upon, what sits at the center of the Hembrillo mystery, is the bones. Over the years, as the missile range has conducted surveys and as the limited archaeological work permitted within its boundaries has proceeded, human remains have been found in the basin in numbers and configurations that the 1880 battle does not fully account for. Some of the remains are consistent with that engagement, positioned, distributed in ways that align with the known movement of forces during the fight. But others are not. Remains found in locations removed from the main battle area. Remains showing evidence of deaths that predate 1880 by a margin that, in some cases, appears substantial. Remains that suggest not a single battle, but a longer, more complicated history of violence in this particular basin. Who these people were, and what happened to them, is where the documented record runs out. The Apache connection is the most immediate framework, and the most historically grounded. The San Andres Mountains were significant to Victorio and to the broader Warm Springs Apache Band in ways that went beyond military tactics. There are accounts in both Army records and in Apache oral tradition suggesting that the basin held particular importance as a water source, as a defensible position, and possibly as something else. Something that the Apache protected with an intensity that the Army found tactically puzzling, given that other positions in the region might have been strategically preferable. Why here? Why this basin specifically defended with such commitment? The straightforward answer is water. The Hembrillo Spring inside the basin was a reliable water source in country where water was survival. Any tactician would defend it. But some researchers have noted that the defense of Hembrillo Basin across multiple engagements, across years, went beyond what water access alone would rationally demand. The Apache returned to this basin repeatedly, at considerable cost, when alternatives existed. This has led some historians to suggest that the basin held significance that the military record, focused on tactical analysis, was not equipped to capture. What that significance might have been opens into speculation that the evidence cannot fully support, but also cannot entirely dismiss. There are accounts, gathered from the edges of the historical record, of the San Andres Mountains containing older sites, places of ceremony, of burial, of accumulated cultural importance that predated the Apache Wars by centuries. The basin's geology includes cave formations and rock shelters, some of which have never been formally surveyed. In the limited archaeological work that has been done within the missile range boundaries, artifacts have surfaced that suggest human presence and activity in the basin stretching back far beyond the 19th century. The older remains, the ones that don't fit the 1880 battle, may be the evidence of that longer history. People who lived here, died here, were buried here across generations, in a place that held meaning precise enough that others fought and died to keep it from being taken. There is also a more specific and more recent thread. In the decades since the missile range was established, a small number of individuals with access to the restricted area have reported anomalies that the official surveys have not addressed. Additional bone deposits in locations that suggest deliberate interment rather than battlefield death. Rock formations that appear worked rather than natural, spatial arrangements that imply intention. None of this has been formally investigated in the way that open, accessible sites would be. The restrictions that have preserved the basin have also prevented the kind of sustained archaeological attention that might resolve these questions. The basin sits behind its federal boundary, undisturbed and largely unstudied. The creosote grows slowly over whatever the soil holds. The ridgelines catch the light each morning in the same shades of gold and rust, indifferent to the questions accumulating below them. And the bones, the ones that fit the record and the ones that don't, remain where they were found, or where they were left, long before anyone thought to ask what this place had meant to the people who chose it, and what they believed was worth dying to protect. Some places accumulate mystery the way canyons accumulate shadow, slowly, layer by layer, until the darkness at the bottom has nothing to do with any single source of shade. The Hembrillo Basin is one of those places. A bowl of restricted silence holding bones that don't fit the official story. A spring that men died returning to. A history longer and more complicated than the military record was designed to contain. Whatever its full meaning, it remains sealed behind its federal boundary, patient and unexamined. What comes next moves deeper into the same mountain country, westward into a range that has its own accumulation of shadows, its own layers, its own particular way of holding what the outside world has tried, repeatedly, to take from it. The Mimbres Mountains rise out of southwestern New Mexico in long, forested ridges that catch the clouds in ways the surrounding desert doesn't. Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir cover the upper slopes, giving way to oak and juniper as the elevation drops, and then to the dry scrub of the valley floors below. The light here shifts constantly. The mountains create their own weather, pulling moisture from the sky, casting shadows that move across the landscape in patterns that make the terrain look alive. It is beautiful country. It is also country that has resisted with remarkable consistency every attempt to fully know it. The Mimbres Valley below the mountains takes its name from the Mimbres people, a branch of the Mogollon culture who lived here from roughly 200 AD until around 1150 AD, when they disappeared from the archaeological record in ways that remain genuinely unexplained. They left behind pottery that is considered among the most sophisticated ever produced in pre-Columbian North America. Black on white geometric designs of extraordinary precision, bowls painted with figures that seem to tell stories no one has yet fully decoded. When the Mimbres buried their dead, they placed a bowl over the face of the deceased, with a hole punched through the bottom. A kill hole, researchers call it, releasing the spirit of the vessel. They were meticulous. They were deliberate. And then, with a completeness that still puzzles archaeologists, they were gone. What they left in the mountains above their valley, if they left anything, is the first layer of the Mimbres mystery. The Spanish arrived in the region centuries later and found evidence, in the mountains and in the accounts of indigenous people they encountered, of mineral wealth. The Mimbres Mountains sit in a geological zone of significant copper, silver, and gold deposits, the same broader mineralized belt that produced the great mines of Arizona and drew prospectors and industrial interests throughout the 19th century. Spanish colonial records reference activity in the region, extraction attempted and sometimes achieved, operations that were established and then abandoned as the political and military situation shifted. Some of those operations were abandoned in haste. This is the consistent thread in the Mimbres treasure accounts. Not a single cache, not a single event, but a series of abandonments. Groups of men who were working the mountains, who had accumulated metal in quantities worth protecting, and who left suddenly enough that what they had accumulated stayed behind. Apache pressure was the most common reason given. The Mimbres Mountains were within the territory of the Mimbreno Apache, a band related to the Warm Springs Apache of Victorio's people, who defended this country with the same fierce consistency that characterized Apache resistance throughout the Southwest. The mountains swallowed what the Spanish left, and the Apache, who knew the mountains better than anyone, kept the knowledge of what was there. This is documented, or nearly documented, in a specific and tantalizing way. In the years following the Apache Wars, as the surviving Mimbreno were confined to reservations and the mountains opened to Anglo prospectors for the first time, a number of independent accounts emerged. From prospectors, from surveyors, from the occasional former Army scout, describing discoveries in the Mimbres high country that suggested prior extraction. Shaft openings, partially collapsed. Rock walls of non-natural construction. In several accounts, processed metal, not ore but refined material, found in quantities that implied organized operation rather than individual prospecting. Most of these discoveries were not followed up. The men who made them were, in many cases, passing through rather than settling. The terrain was difficult. The legal status of mining claims in the region was complicated, and some accounts suggest something more visceral, a reluctance, not always explained, to go deeper into certain parts of the mountains. That reluctance is where the documented record softens into something harder to categorize. The Mimbres Mountains have a reputation, among the communities that live near them and among the researchers who have worked in them, for being disorienting in ways that exceed normal terrain difficulty. Experienced outdoorsmen describe losing their bearings in conditions that shouldn't produce that result. Prospectors report returning to marked locations and finding the landscape subtly, inexplicably different from what they recorded. A small number of people who have spent extended time in the high country describe experiences they are reluctant to discuss directly, a sense of presence, of observation, that they attribute variously to imagination, to altitude, or to something they decline to name. None of this constitutes evidence of anything specific. Mountain terrain disorients people. Isolation produces psychological effects. The human mind, alone in wilderness, finds patterns and presences that aren't there. And yet the accounts accumulate across different decades and different people, with a consistency that is at minimum worth noting. The Mimbres pottery and museum collection stares upward from its kill holes, its geometric figures precise and unreadable, telling a story in a language no one has recovered. The mountains above the valley hold their ridgelines against the moving sky. The old shaft openings, those that haven't collapsed entirely, breathe cold air from whatever depth they reach. And the question the mountains keep returning, quietly, to anyone who stays long enough to ask it, is whether what was hidden here was hidden to be found, or hidden to stay exactly where it is, for reasons that the people who hid it understood completely, and that we are only beginning to guess at. There is a particular quality to mountains that don't want to be known. The Mimbres range has it, that capacity for disorientation, for quiet resistance, for returning people to the valley floor with less certainty than they carried going up. Whether that quality is geological, psychological, or something else entirely, the effect on the historical record is measurable. Men went in. Some didn't come back. Those who did often couldn't fully explain what they had found, or hadn't found, or had experienced in the spaces between. What comes next is a variation on that pattern. A different range, a different desert, but the same essential dynamic. Mountains that seem to take more than they give, and an accumulation of disappearances that the standard explanations have never quite covered. The Sierra Estrella rises abruptly from the desert floor southwest of Phoenix, Arizona, in a way that feels almost theatrical. A sudden dark wall of rock lifting from the flat Sonoran plain without much warning or gradual approach. The name means Star Mountains in Spanish, and from a distance, particularly at dusk when the light catches the ridgeline at a low angle, the range has a quality that justifies the name. The peaks are jagged and angular, the slopes steep and deeply shadowed, the rock a dark volcanic material that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. Up close, the Sierra Estrella is something different. The trails are faint and unreliable. The terrain is broken and steep in ways that aerial views don't fully capture. The desert vegetation, saguaro, chala, brittlebush, covers the lower slopes densely enough to disorient, to slow movement, to make distances deceptive. The heat in summer is not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous, rising off the dark rock in waves that distort the air and the judgment simultaneously. It is, by any honest assessment, a hostile environment. And yet men went there, repeatedly, with tools and supplies and the specific focused intention of prospectors who believed, on the basis of something, rumor, map, direct knowledge, that the mountains held mineral wealth worth the risk. The documented disappearances associated with the Sierra Estrella span roughly from the 1860s through the early 20th century, a period that corresponds with the general prospecting boom that followed the Civil War and the pacification, however brutal and contested, of the Apache resistance in Arizona. The mountains were known to be mineralized. The geology of the range includes formations associated with gold and silver deposits, and small strikes in the surrounding region had established that the broader area was worth investigating. What the Sierra Estrella did not produce, in any documented case, was a successful large-scale mining operation. This is itself unusual. Ranges with comparable geology in Arizona, the Superstitions to the east, the Bradshaws to the north, generated significant mining activity, established claims, recorded production. The Sierra Estrella generated prospectors who went in and, in a disproportionate number of cases, did not come out. The Army records from Fort McDowell and the surrounding posts document recovery operations for missing prospectors in the Sierra Estrella with a frequency that researchers have noted as anomalous. Not every missing man was searched for. The frontier was not organized enough for that. But the ones who were, the ones with families or partners or enough of a reputation that their absence was formally noted, generated searches that in several cases found nothing. Not bodies, not equipment, not evidence of the camp they had been known to establish. Just absence. The Maricopa and Pima peoples who lived in the valley surrounding the Sierra Estrella had their own relationship with the range, and their own understanding of why it was treated with a particular kind of caution. The mountains appear in oral traditions as a place of power. Not evil in the way that Western frameworks might interpret that word, but charged, significant, requiring a specific kind of respect and preparation that casual visitors, focused on extraction, were unlikely to bring with them. Some accounts suggest that the indigenous communities in the region were not surprised by the disappearances, not because they had caused them, but because the mountains had a reputation, established across generations of careful relationship with the landscape, for being unforgiving of people who approach them with the wrong intentions or the wrong preparation. This framing is easy to dismiss as retrospective storytelling, a cultural explanation applied after the fact to events that had mundane causes. Heat exhaustion, falls, dehydration, the ordinary catalog of desert mountain dangers. But the clustering of the disappearances resists the mundane explanation in specific ways. Experienced prospectors, men who had worked comparable terrain elsewhere without incident, vanished in the Sierra Estrella under conditions that their experience should have allowed them to manage. In several documented cases, men disappeared in pairs or small groups, removing the possibility that a single individual's error or incapacitation explains the outcome. And in at least a handful of cases, the last known communications from the missing men, notes left with partners, verbal accounts given to people they passed on the way in, described finding something. Not danger. Something. What that something was, none of them returned to specify. There is a theory, circulated among regional historians and never quite dismissed, that the Sierra Estrella contains one or more significant mineral deposits that were known to pre-contact inhabitants, worked at some point in the distant past, and then deliberately obscured, physically concealed, access routes altered or hidden, in response to the arrival of people who would exploit rather than steward what was there. In this reading, the prospectors who disappeared weren't simply lost to the desert. They were, in some cases, getting close to something that certain parties had strong reasons to protect. Whether those parties were human, historical, and identifiable, or whether the mountains themselves constitute the protective force, in whatever sense that phrase can be meant seriously, is a question the Sierra Estrella has declined, across a century and a half of inquiry, to answer directly. The dark peaks hold their shape against the Arizona sky, absorbing the light the way they always have. And the names in the Army's missing persons records stay exactly where they were entered, waiting perhaps for someone to finally ask the right question. Not every mystery on the frontier was about what was hidden in the earth. Sometimes the mystery was about what was placed there, deliberately, carefully, by human hands with human motives, and then covered over with just enough truth to make the lie believable. The Sierra Estrella took people in and didn't return them. Whatever the reason, geological, geographical, or something harder to categorize, the mountains were passive in their danger. They didn't reach out. They simply didn't let go. What comes next is different. What comes next is a mystery built not by landscape, but by intention. A deception so elaborate, so audacious, that it fooled some of the most sophisticated financial minds in America. And at the center of it, a man who understood something fundamental about the frontier, that in a landscape where everything seemed possible, where fortunes appeared from nowhere and geography rewrote itself every generation, people would believe almost anything if you showed them just enough of the right kind of evidence. In the early 1870s, two men arrived in San Francisco carrying a leather pouch. Inside the pouch were diamonds, rough, uncut, apparently genuine, examined by jewelers in the city who confirmed their authenticity with the confidence of professionals who had no reason to doubt what they were seeing. The men, Philip Arnold and John Slack, were Kentucky-born prospectors with the weathered look of people who had spent real time in real wilderness. They were reluctant to talk. They deflected questions about where the stones had come from. They moved with the careful restraint of men who understood that what they were carrying was dangerous to reveal too quickly. This restraint, calculated or genuine, produced exactly the effect that restraint produces in rooms full of wealthy men who are afraid of missing an opportunity. The investors came to them. What followed was one of the most successful confidence schemes in American history, known as the Great Diamond Hoax of 1872. Arnold and Slack, it eventually emerged, had purchased low-grade diamonds and rubies in London and Amsterdam, industrial stones, cheap in quantity, and had seeded a remote location in the Wyoming Territory with them. Scattered across the ground, tucked into anthills and crevices, arranged with just enough naturalistic randomness to suggest genuine geological occurrence to men who wanted very badly to believe. They convinced some of the wealthiest investors in California. They brought in a respected mining engineer who examined the site and declared it authentic. They attracted the attention of Charles Tiffany himself, who assessed the stones and confirmed their value. The scheme generated investment commitments in the millions of dollars before a geologist named Clarence King, surveying the region for the government, visited the site, found the seeding, and exposed the fraud. By that point, Arnold had taken his money, somewhere between $150,000 and $550,000, depending on the source, an enormous sum by any measure, and returned to Kentucky. Slack had disappeared entirely. Arnold's story has a documented ending, of sorts. He returned to Harlan County, Kentucky, opened a bank, was sued by some of his defrauded investors, settled for a fraction of what he owed, and died in 1878 from complications following a shooting. A business dispute, reportedly, of a separate kind. The money he kept was never fully accounted for. But here is where the mystery begins in earnest, because Arnold's story, strange as it is the legible half of the hoax. John Slack is the missing half. Slack left San Francisco after the exposure of the fraud and was never meaningfully located again. He surfaces once, briefly, in a record from St. Louis in the late 1870s, listed as a coffin maker, a detail so specific and so strange that it reads almost like a message. And then he disappears from the documented record entirely. No death certificate that historians have been able to confirm. No trial, no civil suit naming him specifically. No further sightings that hold up to scrutiny. For a man who had participated in one of the most publicized frauds of the Gilded Age, this invisibility is remarkable. The question that researchers have returned to repeatedly is simple and unanswerable with current evidence. How much did Slack take? Where did he go? And was his disappearance as accidental as it appears? The financial accounting of the hoax has never been fully closed. Arnold's share is estimated, not confirmed. Slack's share is essentially unknown. The total amount extracted from investors moved through enough hands and enough informal arrangements that the paper trail, never clean to begin with, has never been fully reconstructed. Some researchers have suggested that the division between Arnold and Slack was not equal, that one of them was the architect and one was the instrument, and that the architect's share reflected that asymmetry. Which one was, which is a question the historical record refuses to answer cleanly. Arnold was the more visible, the more documented, the one who went home. Slack was the one who vanished. There is a version of this story in which Slack's disappearance was the plan all along, in which the public role of Arnold as the accessible, eventually sued face of the hoax was itself a kind of misdirection, drawing legal and journalistic attention, while the deeper intelligence behind the operation walked quietly away with the larger share. In that version, the coffin maker in St. Louis was not a man in hiding. He was a man who had already completed his disappearance and was living quietly and comfortably in the gap between who he had been and who the world was looking for. The diamond field itself is somewhere in the Wyoming or Colorado high country. The exact location was obscured in the original accounts and has never been definitively identified. The stones that weren't recovered are presumably still there, scattered across the ground, waiting for someone who doesn't know what they're actually finding. And John Slack, whoever he finally was, wherever he finally went, remains exactly as he intended. Nowhere to be found. John Slack understood something that the frontier kept teaching, in one form or another, to anyone paying attention. That the most effective kind of disappearance doesn't look like running. It looks like resolution. A story that closes cleanly enough that no one feels the need to keep pulling at it. Arnold got sued, settled, went home, died. The file closed. And in the shadow of that closed file, Slack simply stopped being findable. It is a particular kind of intelligence, the kind that understands how narrative works, how attention moves, where the eyes of the world will land and where they won't. The kind that builds its exit into the structure of the deception itself, so that by the time anyone thinks to look, the looking is already too late. That intelligence, the ability to use a landscape, to use a story, to use the assumptions of the people watching, is something the frontier produced in abundance. In con men and outlaws and hermits and soldiers, in anyone who needed the land to cover for them. But sometimes the land itself was the deception. Sometimes the landscape didn't hide a person or a fortune. Sometimes what it hid was the truth of its own nature, its own capacity for death. And the maps that men made to navigate it were themselves a kind of lie, not from malice, but from the fundamental impossibility of putting honest marks on paper about a place that killed people simply for being there. There's a stretch of desert in southern New Mexico that has been killing people since before anyone thought to write the deaths down. The Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man, runs for roughly 90 miles between the Rio Grande near present-day Truth or Consequences and the river again near El Paso. It is not a canyon or a mountain range or a dramatic geological feature. It is, in the plainest physical terms, a flat basin. A broad, open expanse of desert scrub, of alkali flats and dry arroyos, of scattered volcanic rock and sparse vegetation that offers neither shade nor sustenance, nor, most critically, water. That absence of water is the Jornada's essential nature. In a region where survival was organized entirely around the locations of reliable water sources, the Jornada was a 90-mile gap, a place where the ordinary logic of desert travel broke down completely and where the only viable strategy was to move fast enough that you reached the other side before your body's reserves ran out. Many didn't. The Spanish began using the Jornada as a route in the late 16th century as part of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the royal road connecting Mexico City to the northern colonial settlements of New Mexico. The choice was not made in ignorance of the danger. It was made because the alternative routes were longer, and length was itself a form of danger. The Jornada killed people efficiently, but it killed fewer people than the months of additional travel the alternatives required. This calculus, accepting a known death toll as preferable to a larger unknown one, is the first layer of the Jornada's particular darkness. The maps that the Spanish made of the route are among the earliest cartographic documents of the American Southwest. They are also, by modern assessment, deeply unreliable in specific ways that cost lives for generations. The distances between the few water sources the maps identify are consistently underestimated. The locations of emergency water, tinajas, rock catchments that filled during rains, are marked with a confidence the actual terrain doesn't support. The seasonal variability of those sources, which could mean the difference between a reliable pool and a dry depression of cracked mud, is not represented at all. Whether these errors were the result of honest miscalculation or something more complicated is a question the historical record can't fully resolve. But there is a specific and documented phenomenon associated with the Jornada maps that moves the question from cartographic error into more ambiguous territory. Multiple independent surveys of the route, conducted across different decades and by parties with no connection to one another, produced maps that disagreed with each other in ways that exceeded normal surveying variance. Not just in the small details that variable equipment and variable skill would explain. In the fundamental measurements, the distances between landmarks, the relative positions of features that should have been fixed and verifiable. The Jornada, in other words, was a route that resisted accurate mapping with a consistency that puzzled the people trying to map it. Some of this is explicable. The flat, featureless terrain offered poor triangulation points. Heat shimmer distorted visual measurements. The psychological pressure of moving through a lethal environment affected concentration and judgment in ways that introduced error. These are real factors. But researchers who have examined the surviving maps in detail have noted something that the practical explanations don't fully cover. A pattern of specific errors, particular distances consistently overestimated in ways that would encourage a traveler to ration water more conservatively than necessary, particular landmarks consistently misplaced in ways that would cause a party to expect water sooner than it arrived. Errors, in other words, that, if deliberate, would constitute a kind of trap. A map that looked authoritative and functioned as a sentence. Who would make such a map, and why, is a question that opens onto a landscape of motive that the historical record can only partially illuminate. Control of the Camino Real was commercially and politically significant. A route that only certain parties could navigate reliably because only certain parties had access to accurate information was a route that generated dependency. In a colonial economy built on the movement of silver and goods between Mexico City and Santa Fe, that dependency had real value. There are accounts, fragmentary and unverified, of guides, indigenous, mestizo, occasionally Anglo in the later period, who knew the Jornada in ways the maps didn't capture, who knew where the Tanajas held water in dry years and where they didn't, who knew the route at night, by star positions and ground feel, in ways that no document recorded because the knowledge lived in bodies and passed through relationships rather than paper. When those guides died, the knowledge died with them, or retreated into communities that had no reason to share it with the people the maps were killing. The Jornada is quieter now. The interstate runs along its edge. The water question has been solved by infrastructure that the Spanish couldn't have imagined. But the old route is still there, unmarked and largely unwalked, crossing the basin in a straight line between 2 points that the desert separates with 90 miles of indifference. And somewhere in the gap between the maps that survive and the knowledge that didn't, the full count of who the Jornada took and what they carried with them into that dry crossing has never been, and may never be, complete. The Jornada del Muerto killed without malice, without intention. It was geography doing what geography does, presenting a set of conditions that the unprepared, the unlucky, and the deliberately misled could not survive. The deaths it accumulated across centuries were real and largely uncounted, and the maps that failed to prevent them may or may not have been designed to do exactly what they did. But the Jornada's darkness is the darkness of indifference, of a landscape that simply didn't care. What comes next is different. What comes next is the darkness of intention, of human decisions made in the pre-dawn hours of a spring morning, organized and deliberate, aimed at people who had been told they were safe. That is a different kind of unaccountable, and it leaves a different kind of silence behind. The confluence of Aravaipa Creek and the San Pedro River in southern Arizona is a place of unexpected gentleness. The creek runs clear over smooth stones, lined with cottonwoods that turn gold in the fall and offer deep shade in the summer. The canyon walls above the confluence are soft sandstone, layered in warm ochre and cream. It is the kind of place that, stripped of its history, would simply be beautiful. A reliable water source in dry country, a sheltered location, the kind of geography that has drawn people for thousands of years for the most ordinary of reasons. The Aravaipa Apache knew this. It was their country, in the most fundamental sense. The land their families had occupied, moved through, and returned to across generations. In the late winter of 1871, a band of Aravaipa Apache under the leadership of Escamizan came to Camp Grant, a U.S. Army post near the confluence, and surrendered. They were given a reservation near the creek. They were told they were under the protection of the United States government. Lieutenant Royal Whitman, the officer in charge, by multiple accounts treated them with genuine care, ensuring they had food, that their numbers were documented, that the arrangement was as formal and protected as he could make it within his authority. There were approximately 500 people in the camp by late April of 1871, documented, named, many of them, present and accounted for in the Army's own records. On the morning of April 30th, they were attacked. The attacking force, somewhere between 140 and 150 men, composed of Tucson civilians, members of the Papago Nation, and Mexican-American participants, moved on the camp before dawn and struck while most of the occupants were asleep. The attack lasted approximately 30 minutes. When it was over, between 100 and 150 Aravaipa Apache were dead. The Army's own subsequent investigation, conducted by General George Stoneman, placed the number at 1 to 44. Other estimates run higher. 29 children were taken captive. These are the documented facts. They are not in serious historical dispute. What is disputed, what remains genuinely, painfully unresolved, is almost everything that surrounds them. Begin with the dead. The 144 people counted in the Army's investigation were counted in the immediate aftermath of the attack by soldiers who arrived after the perpetrators had left. They were not individually identified in the official record. They were not named. A count was made of bodies in a location of mass violence by men operating under difficult conditions with limited time, and that count, a number, not a list, became the official accounting of who died at Camp Grant. This means that of the 500 people who were documented as present in the camp, the record does not establish with any precision which specific individuals were among the dead and which survived. The Army knew how many. It did not record who. This gap in the record is not merely an administrative failure. It is the foundation of an unresolved historical mystery that has never been adequately addressed. The question of the survivors, and what became of them. Some survivors are documented. Escamizan himself survived, as did a portion of the camp's population who were absent or who escaped during the attack. In the weeks and months following, some survivors came back to the area. Some were integrated into other Apache communities. Some disappeared into a diaspora that the historical record has never fully traced. But the gap between 500 documented residents and 144 documented dead leaves a substantial number of people whose fates are simply unrecorded. What happened to them? Where did they go? Which families were destroyed entirely, leaving no one to carry the names forward? Which individuals survived and built lives that the official record, which had failed them catastrophically, never bothered to follow? These questions have been taken up by Apache historians and community members who have worked to reconstruct, through oral tradition and genealogical research, the human reality behind the Army's number. That work is ongoing and incomplete and complicated by the same systematic suppression of indigenous record-keeping that appears throughout this history. But there is another layer to the Camp Grant mystery that sits alongside the human accounting: the question of the 29 children. The children taken captive during the attack were distributed in the days and weeks that followed among the families of the Tucson participants and into the broader network of households in the Arizona Territory that practiced a form of indigenous child servitude that existed in a legal gray zone between adoption and slavery. Lieutenant Whitman made immediate efforts to locate and recover the children. He was largely unsuccessful. The territorial government in Tucson, whose citizens had organized and participated in the attack, was not inclined to assist. A small number of children were eventually returned. Accounts vary, but the figure is generally placed at around 6. The remaining 23 or so simply vanished into the domestic arrangements of the territory. their Apache identities submerged, their origins known to the families who held them and to almost no one else. The men who organized and participated in the Camp Grant attack were tried for murder in Tucson in December of 1871. The jury deliberated for 19 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. Not a single person was convicted of any crime in connection with the deaths of 144 people and the abduction of 29 children. The 19-minute deliberation is its own kind of document. It tells you everything about who the territorial justice system was designed to protect and who it was designed to ignore. What it doesn't tell you, what no document tells you, is what happened to the children who were never returned. Whether any of them were eventually told who they were. Whether any of them found their way back to the Aravaipa Apache community. Whether there are descendants alive today in southern Arizona or elsewhere who carry Apache ancestry they have no way of knowing about because the record that would tell them was either never made or deliberately obscured. Genealogical researchers who have worked on this question believe the answer to that last question is almost certainly yes. That there are people alive whose family trees contain a silence, a generation that doesn't connect, a great-great-grandmother whose origins are listed as unknown. That corresponds to what happened at the confluence of Aravaipa Creek on the morning of April 30th, 1871. The creek still runs clear over its smooth stones. The cottonwoods still line the banks. The canyon walls hold their warm ochre light in the afternoons, unchanged, as if the morning they witnessed was just another morning. But in the space between 500 people documented present and the silence that followed, in the 23 names that were taken away with the children and never brought back, there is a human accounting that was never completed. And the question of whether it ever can be, and what it would mean for the people waiting on the other side of it, remains one of the most important unresolved questions this landscape holds. There are silences that close like wounds, slowly, imperfectly, leaving something altered in the tissue of the record. The Camp Grant silence is that kind, a human accounting that was never completed, children whose names were taken with them into households that had no interest in preserving what those names meant. The creek runs on, the canyon holds its light, and somewhere in the genealogical gaps of southern Arizona families, the unfinished business of that morning in 1871 persists. Not as mystery in the romantic sense, but as an absence that has real people on the other side of it, waiting for a connection the record was designed to prevent. What comes next is different in texture, though not entirely different in its relationship to the Southwest's capacity for concealment. Because the land that witnessed Camp Grant is the same land that, according to some of the most contested artifacts in American treasure hunting, conceals something else entirely. Something older, something that was mapped in stone by hands whose identity remains a source of genuine historical argument. And those maps, if they are what some believe them to be, have been sending people into dangerous country for decades. They are called the Peralta stone maps, and they are unlike almost any other artifact associated with Western treasure lore. Not paper, not parchment. Stone, flat, worked slabs of what appears to be rhyolite, carved with symbols, figures, text, and what seem to be topographic representations of a specific landscape in central Arizona. They were reportedly discovered in 1949 by a man named Travis Tumlinson in the desert near the Superstition Mountains, east of Phoenix. How exactly they came to light, and the precise circumstances of their discovery, is itself a matter of conflicting accounts. There are, depending on how you count related pieces, somewhere between 4 and 8 stones in the collection. The most significant show what appear to be maps, contour lines suggesting terrain, markers that researchers have interpreted as indicating trails, water sources, and the locations of mine shafts. Text carved into some of the stones is in a form of Spanish that specialists have analyzed with sharply divided conclusions. Some see a language consistent with 18th century colonial usage. Others see inconsistencies that suggest later fabrication. The stones also carry symbols that don't fit neatly into either Spanish colonial cartographic tradition or any other identified system. A heart shape, a cross, figures that some researchers have interpreted as directional markers and others have read as religious or ceremonial in nature. What they are pointing to, if they are pointing to anything, is the Superstition Mountains. This is where the Peralta stone maps connect to one of the most persistent treasure legends in American history, the Lost Dutchman's Gold Mine, a supposed deposit of extraordinary richness somewhere in the superstitions that has drawn searchers for over a century and generated its own considerable body of disappearances and deaths. The stones, according to the interpretation that has driven most of the search activity, are a set of directions. A guide to the location of mines worked by the Peralta family, a Mexican mining dynasty that allegedly operated in the superstitions in the early 19th century before being driven out or killed by Apache resistance. This is the framework that the treasure hunting community has largely accepted, and it is also the framework that academic historians have largely rejected. The historical evidence for large-scale Peralta mining operations in the superstitions is thin to non-existent in the archival record. The Peralta family name appears in colonial Mexican records in ways that establish their existence, but the specific connection to Superstition Mountain gold is not documented in any source that historians have been able to independently verify. The mines, in the academic consensus, are almost certainly legend, a story that grew in the telling, accumulating detail and apparent corroboration the way frontier stories do, until the legend itself became a kind of evidence for its own truth. But the stones are real. They exist. They are held in private collections and have been examined by enough credentialed people, geologists, linguists, historians, cartographers, that their physical reality is not in question. What is in question is everything else. The geological analysis of the stones has produced divided results. Some assessments suggest weathering patterns consistent with genuine age, surfaces that have been exposed to the elements for a century or more, patina that is difficult to fake convincingly. Other analyses have identified tool marks and carving characteristics that argue for more recent manufacture. No single examination has been definitive enough to settle the question. The linguistic analysis of the Spanish text has been similarly inconclusive. The vocabulary and grammatical forms are ambiguous, consistent with colonial Spanish in some features, anomalous in others. Whether the anomalies represent genuine archaism, regional variation, or the errors of a forger working from incomplete knowledge is a question that specialists have answered differently depending on which specialist you ask. And then there are the maps themselves, the topographic portions, the lines and markers that seem to represent actual terrain. Several researchers working independently have attempted to match the carved representations to the actual landscape of the Superstition Mountains. Some have reported correspondences, features on the stones that align with specific geological formations, drainage patterns, ridgelines in ways that seem too precise to be coincidental. Others have found no reliable match, or have found matches that are so general they could fit multiple locations in a range of comparable terrain. The search has not been without cost. The Superstition Mountains have their own catalog of disappearances and deaths associated with treasure hunting, a list that begins before the stones were discovered and has continued after. Whether those deaths are the result of the mountain's genuine physical dangers, of conflicts between competing searchers, or of something else, is a question that the Superstition Mountains share with several other ranges in this history. What makes the Peralta stone maps uniquely strange? What separates them from ordinary treasure map folklore? Is the artifact itself. Most treasure legends don't come with physical evidence. Most lost mine stories are pure narrative, transmitted verbally, documented only in the accounts of people who heard them from someone who heard them from someone else. The stones exist. You can hold them. You can run your fingers along the carved lines and feel the weight of the question they represent. Genuine relic or elaborate construction, ancient direction or modern deception. Either answer generates its own mystery. If they are genuine, something extraordinary is hidden in the Superstition Mountains, and the carved lines on ancient stone are the key to finding it. If they are fabricated, someone made them. Someone with the skill, the knowledge, the patience, and the motive to create artifacts complex enough to fool repeated expert examination. And that person, that intelligence, That intention has never been conclusively identified. The stones sit in their cases, carved and patient, holding their question the way stone holds everything, quietly, for as long as it takes. The Peralta stones hold their question in carved silence, genuine relic or careful fabrication, ancient direction or modern deception. The answer stubbornly refuses to arrive. What makes them enduring is precisely that ambiguity, the inability to close the file, the sense that the truth is present somewhere in the object itself, if only the right examination could unlock it. But not every unsolved mystery of the frontier involves objects or landscapes or hidden wealth. Some involve people, specific named documented people who were present and then were not, and whose absence created a silence that the legal system tried and failed to fill. The frontier produced many such silences. Men killed in ways that everyone understood and no one could prove. Justice attempted and deflected by the same networks of money and influence that had made the killing possible in the first place. Files that closed not because the truth was found, but because the truth was inconvenient to the people with the power to keep looking. The murder of Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain is one of the most consequential unsolved crimes in the history of the American Southwest. It is a story about a man who knew too much, a legal case that threatened powerful people, and a disappearance so complete that the question of what happened has never been answered to the satisfaction of a court. The white sands of southern New Mexico are one of the most disorienting landscapes in North America. The gypsum dunes rise and fall in long white waves, brilliant in sunlight, luminous under moonlight, uniform in a way that removes the ordinary visual anchors of navigation. Distance is impossible to judge accurately. Landmarks don't exist in the conventional sense. The white extends in every direction to a horizon that seems always the same distance away, and the silence is the kind that makes a traveler aware of their own heartbeat. It was near the edges of this landscape, in the scrub desert bordering the Tularosa Basin, that Albert Fountain and his 8-year-old son Henry disappeared on the first day of February 1896. Fountain was not an ordinary man. He had been a soldier, a journalist, a state senator, and by 1896 was one of the most prominent attorneys in New Mexico Territory, a man whose legal career had been defined by his willingness to take on powerful interests. In January of 1896, he had successfully obtained indictments against a number of cattlemen in Lincoln County, including men connected to the powerful Oliver Lee, on charges of cattle rustling. The indictments were the culmination of years of legal work. They were also, as events would suggest, a death sentence. Fountain was traveling home from Lincoln to Las Cruces with his young son when they vanished. Their buggy was found abandoned near the San Andres Mountains, the same range that borders the Hembrillo Basin, the same country that had already accumulated its own history of disappearances. The horses were gone. There were signs of a struggle. Blood was found on the ground near the buggy, and in the sand nearby, investigators found the tracks of multiple riders, men who had waited and intercepted, and then departed in a direction that led into the desert. No bodies were ever found. This is the central fact around which everything else in the Fountain case turns. Without bodies, the legal case for murder, though circumstantially powerful, could not be closed with the finality that conviction requires. The absence of remains was not accidental. It was, investigators believed from the beginning, deliberate. The product of people who understood that a body is evidence, and that evidence eliminated is a case weakened. Pat Garrett. Yes, the same Pat Garrett who had killed Billy the Kid 15 years earlier, was appointed sheriff of Donna Ana County specifically to investigate the Fountain murders. His investigation pointed with increasing certainty toward Oliver Lee and his associate Jim Gilliland as the primary suspects. In 1899, after years of legal maneuvering and political obstruction, Lee and Gilliland were finally brought to trial. They were acquitted. The trial was a study in the operation of frontier justice when powerful men are in the dock. The defense attorney was Albert Fall, a man who would later become U.S. Secretary of the Interior and would eventually go to prison for his role in the Teapot Dome scandal, a corruption case that would define an era. Fall's defense of Lee and Gilliland was masterful, technical, and effective. The prosecution's case, hampered by the absence of the bodies that would have made it unassailable, could not overcome reasonable doubt as Fall constructed it. Lee and Gilliland walked out of the courthouse free men, and the Fountain case officially went cold. But cold is not the same as closed. The question of where the bodies are buried has never been answered. The San Andres Mountains, which absorbed so much of the region's violence, are the most commonly suggested location. Vast, rugged, restricted now within the boundaries of the White Sands Missile Range, accessible only under controlled conditions. The same federal boundary that seals the Hembrillo Basin seals much of the territory into which the killer's tracks led. Whether the bodies were buried in those mountains, or moved, or disposed of in a way that has left no recoverable trace, is unknown. Several searches over the decades have found nothing. The terrain is large enough and difficult enough that absence of discovery is not evidence of absence. The political dimensions of the case extend further than the trial. Albert Fall's involvement, first as defense attorney, later as a federal official, ultimately as a convicted felon, has led some researchers to suggest that the Fountain murders were not simply a local cattle war killing, but something more organized. That the indictments Fountain had obtained threatened interests that reached beyond Lincoln County, and that the response to those indictments was coordinated at a level that local cattle rustling disputes don't typically generate. Who made the decision in that reading, and who carried it out, and who ensured that the legal aftermath would be managed? These are questions that the trial record raises without answering. Pat Garrett himself was murdered in 1908, shot in the back of the head on a road outside Las Cruces. His murder was also never solved. The man tried for it was acquitted. The pattern, violence, trial, acquittal, silence, repeated itself with a consistency that was either coincidence or signature. The White Dunes moved slowly eastward, as they always have, driven by the prevailing winds, covering and uncovering the desert floor at their own pace. Somewhere in the country they border, in the mountains or the basin or the scrub desert between, Albert Fountain and his 8-year-old son Henry have been waiting for more than a century. For someone to find them, for the record to finally say, with the specificity that only remains can provide, what happened on the road from Lincoln on the first day of February 1896, and for the silence that was so carefully constructed around that day to finally break. There are crimes that leave a shape in the historical record even when they leave no bodies, no convictions, no resolution. The Fountain murders are that kind, a shape defined entirely by its edges, by what surrounds the emptiness at the center. A man, a child, a buggy in the sand, and tracks leading into country that has kept it secret for more than a century. The silence that was built around that case was constructed by people with names, with lawyers, with political connections powerful enough to turn a murder trial into an acquittal in a matter of days. It was an architectural silence, deliberate, load-bearing, designed to hold. But not every disappearance in this country was the product of that kind of organized concealment. Some things vanished not because powerful people needed them to, but because the land itself, the distances, the terrain, the sheer indifferent scale of the Southwest, was capable of swallowing things whole without any human assistance at all. And sometimes, the most baffling disappearances are the ones where no one needed to do anything, where the land simply took what passed through it and kept it. Cooke's Peak rises from the desert floor of southwestern New Mexico with the particular authority of an isolated prominence, a mountain that stands apart from the ranges around it, visible from distances that make it a natural landmark, a waypoint, a reference point for travelers crossing country that offered very few of them. The peak itself is a double summit of dark rock, rising to just under 8,000 feet, presiding over the Mimbres Valley to the east and the broad desert basin to the west, with an unobstructed view that made it militarily significant, navigationally essential, and spiritually important to the peoples who had known it longest. The Butterfield Overland Mail Route passed near Cooke's Peak in the late 1850s, threading through Cooke's Canyon below the mountain, a passage that was among the most dangerous on the entire southern overland trail. The canyon was a natural ambush point, its walls close enough and high enough to funnel travelers into a corridor where escape was limited and observation from above was easy. Apache raiders used it with devastating effectiveness. The casualty rate in Cooke's Canyon during the operational years of the Butterfield route was high enough that the company struggled to maintain service and eventually could not. This is the documented context. A mountain, a canyon, a road, and a history of violence concentrated enough that the landscape itself seems to carry it. Into this context, sometime in the early 1880s, the precise date lost to the unreliability of frontier record-keeping, a stagecoach disappeared. The details that survive are fragmentary and come from multiple sources that don't entirely agree. What the accounts share is this: a stage operating in the Cooke's Peak corridor, carrying passengers and a strongbox, departed from one end of its route and did not arrive at the other. Search parties were sent. The road was examined, and what was found, or more precisely, what was not found, is the center of the mystery. No wreckage, no strongbox, no bodies of passengers or crew, no horses, no physical evidence of the stage's passage beyond the point at which witnesses last reported seeing it. In a region where stagecoach attacks were common and well documented, where the aftermath of raids and robberies left material evidence that searchers routinely found, this completeness of absence was unusual enough to generate its own category of explanation. The straightforward reading is Apache attack followed by complete removal of evidence, a raid so thorough that everything of value, including the vehicle itself, was taken or destroyed, and the remains of those killed were either taken as well or scattered in terrain that the search parties failed to cover adequately. This was not impossible. Apache tactical practice included thorough clearance of attack sites, and the canyon terrain was complex enough that a determined search could still miss significant areas. But several details complicate this explanation in ways that investigators at the time found difficult to resolve. The timing and location of the disappearance fall within a period when Apache activity in the immediate Cooke's Peak corridor had decreased. Not ended, but reduced enough that other stages were moving through without incident. The specific road conditions at the time of the disappearance were known to multiple parties, and no attack was reported by any of them in the relevant window. Which raises the possibility that the threat, if there was one, didn't come from outside the stage. Frontier stagecoach robbery from within, drivers, guards, or passengers who arranged the apparent disappearance of a coach to cover the theft of its strongbox, was known to occur. The incentive existed. The mechanics were plausible. A coach driven off the main road into terrain where it could be concealed, passengers and crew dealt with in ways that left no immediate evidence. A strongbox removed and distributed among conspirators. This was not beyond the operational capacity of people who knew the route and its rhythms. The contents of the strongbox on the missing stage are themselves a matter of conflicting accounts. Some sources suggest military payroll, gold coin in quantities significant enough to motivate elaborate action. Others suggest mining proceeds from operations in the Mimbres mountains to the north, the same mineralized range that appears elsewhere in this history. The discrepancy in the accounts may reflect genuine uncertainty, or it may reflect deliberate obfuscation by parties who had reasons not to establish publicly what exactly had been lost. There is a third thread that local accounts introduce, and that sits at the more speculative edge of the evidence. Cooke's Peak had its own reputation among the communities that lived in its shadow. A reputation similar to the San Andres and the Sierra Estrella for being country where things that entered did not always return. Not a reputation for supernatural danger exactly, but for a quality of terrain and orientation that made the landscape treacherous in ways that experience alone didn't fully protect against. Several of the search party members who combed Cooke's Canyon and the surrounding terrain in the weeks after the disappearance reported, in accounts recorded much later, that they found the canyon disorienting in ways that exceeded its physical complexity. Directions that should have held didn't. Distances that should have been consistent weren't. One account describes a search party member who was separated from the group for several hours in terrain that, by any objective measure, should not have allowed that degree of confusion. These accounts are anecdotal and arrive at second or third hand. They prove nothing, but they rhyme with other accounts from other ranges in this same country, and that consistency, across different people, different decades, different specific locations, is at minimum worth sitting with. Cooke's Peak stands as it always has, double-summited and solitary, watching the desert floor below with the patience of a landmark that has outlasted every question directed at it. The road through the canyon is gone now, or nearly so. Traces of the Butterfield route remain for those who know where to look, ruts pressed into the desert floor by wheels that haven't turned in a century and a half. And somewhere in the terrain between those old ruts and the mountain that watched over them, a stage went in and didn't come out. And the full account of what happened between those two facts has never, in all the time since, been recovered. The canyon at Cooke's Peak swallowed a stage and offered nothing back. No wreckage, no remains, no resolution. Just the old ruts pressed into the desert floor and the mountain watching from above, patient and uninformative. It is a particular kind of frontier mystery, that one. Human in its probable causes, robbery, conspiracy, the ordinary violence of a dangerous road, but geographic in its preservation. The land absorbed the evidence the way it absorbed everything else that passed through it, without preference or malice, simply by being large enough and indifferent enough that what disappeared into it stayed disappeared. But there are places in this country where the geography itself is the mystery, where the landscape doesn't merely conceal what happened, where the landscape is what happened, where the rock and the elevation and the sheer physical presence of the place are inseparable from the story attached to it. Those places tend to be ancient. They tend to carry histories that predate the frontier by centuries, and they tend with a consistency that is either meaningful or coincidental depending on how you approach such things, to be places where people disappeared in ways that the surrounding communities never fully explained. Katzimo rises from the high desert of central New Mexico with a verticality that stops conversation. There is no gentle approach to it, no slope that eases the eye upward. The mesa simply exists, a sandstone butte lifting approximately 430 feet from the surrounding plain and walls that are, on most sides, essentially sheer. The rock is warm sandstone, layered in the horizontals that characterize the Colorado Plateau geology, banded in ochre and cream and a faded rust that deepens in the afternoon light. The top is flat, as mesas are, wide enough to have supported habitation, high enough that the surrounding landscape opens in every direction to the horizon. The Acoma Pueblo people, whose ancestral home of Sky City sits on a neighboring mesa to the southeast, know Katzimo by a name that translates roughly as the Enchanted Mesa. They have known it longer than any written record extends, and the story they carry about it, the story that has made the mesa a subject of anthropological inquiry, scientific expedition, and persistent wonder for well over a century, is a story about a catastrophe, a community, and a disappearance that the rock itself may still hold evidence of. The account, as preserved in Acoma oral tradition, is this. Katzimo was once inhabited. The Acoma, or their ancestors, lived on top of the mesa, a settlement chosen for the same reasons that drove the construction of Sky City, the defensive logic of elevation, the inaccessibility that made attack from below extraordinarily difficult. The path to the top was a single trail cut into the rock face, accessible only to those who knew it and physically demanding even for them. At some point in the past, the oral tradition does not provide a date in the Western sense, locating the event in a framework of ancestral time rather than calendrical sequence. A catastrophe struck the mesa. A storm, in most versions of the account. A section of the trail was destroyed. The rock collapsed or eroded in a way that severed the only connection between the top of the mesa and the ground below. At the time of the collapse, most of the community was below, working the fields in the valley, gathering food, conducting the ordinary business of survival. A small number of people remained on top. Elderly members of the community, women, children, possibly others whose specific circumstances the account doesn't detail. They could not get down. The people below could not get up. and the ones on top, cut off from water, from food, from any means of descent, died there. This is the account that the Acoma have carried. It is a story of loss, of severing, of people trapped by the same geography that had protected them. It is told not as myth in the dismissive sense, but as historical memory, an event that happened, that shaped the community's understanding of Katzimo as a place apart, a place of the dead, a place that commands a particular kind of respect and distance. In 1897, a scientific expedition arrived to investigate the account. Frederick Webb Hodge, an ethnologist working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, led a team that attempted to access the top of Katzimo and determine whether physical evidence supported the oral tradition. The attempt was serious, and the methodology was, by the standards of the time, rigorous. The team examined the mesa walls, identified the probable location of the ancient trail, and eventually succeeded in reaching the summit via a system of ropes and considerable effort. What they found, and did not find, became the subject of a significant academic debate that has never been fully resolved. Hodge's team reported finding evidence of habitation on the top of the mesa, pottery sherds, the remnants of what appeared to be structural foundations, material consistent with human occupation at some point in the past. This was reported as confirmation, partial at least, of the oral tradition, evidence that people had indeed lived on Katzimo before the catastrophe the Acoma described. A competing expedition, organized shortly after Hodges by a man named F.W. Putnam, reached the top through different means and reported different findings. Putnam's team found pottery and structural evidence as well, but interpreted the occupation as temporary or ceremonial rather than permanent residential. A seasonal use site, perhaps, rather than a community home. In Putnam's reading, the Acoma account was not literally true, but metaphorically significant. A story encoding cultural memory of a place that had been used and then abandoned, transformed by oral transmission into a narrative of catastrophic loss. The debate between these two interpretations, literal historical event versus encoded cultural memory, has continued in various forms ever since. What neither expedition resolved, and what subsequent visits to the mesa have not definitively settled, is the question of remains. If people died on top of Katzimo, trapped by a destroyed trail, dying over days or weeks from exposure and thirst, their remains should be there. Bone endures in the dry southwest climate with remarkable persistence. The aridity that preserves organic material in desert contexts would, in principle, make the top of Katzimo an excellent site for the preservation of human remains from an event several centuries in the past. Hodges' expedition did not report finding human remains. Putnam's did not either. This absence has been used by skeptics to argue that the catastrophic death event never occurred, that the mesa top contains archaeological evidence of use, but not of the specific tragedy the oral tradition describes. But the absence requires some scrutiny before it can bear that weight. The top of Katzimo is not small. It covers several acres of broken, rocky terrain. The same erosional processes that have carved the mesa walls have worked the surface as well, creating depressions, crevices, areas of accumulated rubble that a surface survey could easily miss. The expeditions that reached the top spent limited time there, under physically demanding conditions, with methodological frameworks that were not oriented toward systematic skeletal recovery. More significantly, the Acoma themselves have maintained a consistent position about Katzimo across the century, and more since the expeditions. It is a sacred site. The dead who are on it belong to it. The appropriate relationship with it is respectful distance, not excavation. Several Acoma community members who were consulted during the expedition period indicated, with varying degrees of directness, that the mesa top was not a place where outside investigators had the standing to determine what was or was not present. This position is not obstructionist. It is the expression of a coherent and internally consistent understanding of what the site is and what it requires. From within that understanding, the question of whether outside expeditions found human remains is less important than the community's own knowledge of what happened there. Knowledge that doesn't require external verification because it was never dependent on it. What this means for the mystery, from the outside is that the evidence is genuinely and perhaps permanently ambiguous. The physical record is incomplete. The oral tradition is consistent and specific, but not independently verifiable in the ways that archaeological standards require. The gap between those two forms of knowing is real, and it is a gap that the Mesa itself, inaccessible, sacred, sovereign in a sense that predates all the political boundaries drawn around it, is under no obligation to close. The sandstone walls catch the late afternoon light in shades of amber and rust. The flat top holds its silence above the plain, 400 feet of vertical separation between what is knowable from below and what remains, in every meaningful sense, above. A community lost people it loved to a stone that would not let them down. Whether the evidence of that loss is preserved on the mesa top, waiting in the dry air for a reckoning that may never come, or whether the Mesa has already given what it will give, and the rest belongs only to the people whose story it is a question that Katsumo answers in the only way it knows how: by rising, unchanging, into the desert sky, and keeping, as it always has, its own counsel. Katsumo keeps its counsel in the way that sacred things do, not with hostility, not with concealment exactly, but with a kind of settled patience that makes the outside world's questions feel, in the end, like the wrong questions. The Mesa doesn't owe an answer. It simply is. And the community whose loss it holds has its own relationship with that fact, one that doesn't require validation from the people standing below with notebooks and measuring instruments. There is something clarifying about that, about a mystery that announces plainly that some things are not for outside knowing, that the appropriate response is not more investigation, but more respect. What comes next does not offer that kind of clarity. What comes next is a canyon that also keeps its secrets, but not out of sanctity, out of violence, out of the particular silence that follows when men with gold and men who want gold meet in a narrow place, and only some of them leave. Guadalupe Canyon cuts through the borderlands where Arizona meets New Mexico, and both meet the northern edge of the Mexican state of Sonora, a convergence of jurisdictions that, in the 1880s, meant a convergence of lawlessness. The canyon itself is a deep, sinuous cut through the Guadalupe Mountains, carrying a seasonal stream between walls of volcanic rock that rise steeply on both sides. Cottonwoods line the canyon floor where water reaches the surface. The walls above them are dark basalt and rhyolite, dense and unyielding, the kind of rock that absorbs heat through the day and radiates it back through the night in a way that makes the canyon feel inhabited even when it is empty. It is remote country, even now. In the 1880s, it was genuinely beyond the reliable reach of any law enforcement on either side of the border. A corridor used by smugglers, by cattle thieves, by anyone who needed to move between countries without documentation or oversight. It was used by the Apache, whose own borders preceded and superseded the ones the governments had drawn. And it was used, according to the accounts that give this canyon its particular history, by men carrying gold. The documented event at the center of the Guadalupe Canyon mystery is the ambush of July 1881. A party of cowboys associated with the Clanton family, the same Clantons whose name is permanently attached to the gunfight at the OK Corral, which would occur just 3 months later, was camped in Guadalupe Canyon when they were attacked before dawn. The attack was swift and devastating. 5 men were killed. 1 survived by hiding in the brush until the attackers withdrew. The official investigation attributed the attack to Apache raiders, specifically to Geronimo's band, which was active in the region at the time and had conducted similar attacks on both sides of the border. This attribution was accepted by the territorial authorities, and the case was closed within the framework of the broader Apache conflict. But the survivors' account, and the accounts of people who knew the Clanton operation, introduced complications that the Apache raider explanation has never fully resolved. The men who died in Guadalupe Canyon were not simply cowboys camping between drives. They were, according to multiple independent accounts gathered over the years following the attack, transporting something. The specifics vary in the telling, Some accounts describe Mexican silver, moved across the border in a transaction that bypassed the customs arrangements that legitimate commerce required. Others describe gold, either from Mexican mining operations or from a source that the accounts are deliberately vague about. A few accounts suggest that the cargo was the proceeds of a specific robbery, the details of which were kept quiet by everyone with knowledge of them for reasons that are not difficult to imagine. What the accounts agree on is that the men in the canyon that night were not traveling empty, and what the physical record suggests, the absence of whatever they were carrying from the aftermath of the attack, is that whoever hit the camp knew what was there and came specifically for it. This is the detail that separates the Guadalupe Canyon ambush from a straightforward Apache raid in the minds of the researchers who have examined it most carefully. Apache attacks on travelers in this period were motivated by a combination of strategic military logic, resource acquisition, and resistance to the encroachment that was destroying their way of life. They were not, as a general matter, intelligence-driven operations targeting specific cargo on specific nights based on advanced knowledge of a particular party's movements and contents. The Guadalupe Canyon attack has the signature of something different, something that knew where the men would be, when they would be there, and what they were carrying. That signature points toward human informants, toward a network of knowledge that connected the people who knew about the cargo to the people who took it. Who those people were is where the documented record fractures into competing theories. The most straightforward theory implicates rival smuggling or rustling operations, competitors in the same extra-legal economy who had both the motive and the means to eliminate a party carrying goods they wanted. The borderlands in this period were not organized crime in the modern sense, but they had their own hierarchies, their own territorial arrangements, and their own enforcement mechanisms. A party moving valuable cargo through a canyon that multiple operations used would have been visible to people with interests in that corridor. A more specific theory, developed by researchers who have examined the Clanton network in detail, suggests a connection to the complex web of alliances and rivalries that surrounded the Tombstone faction conflicts of 1880 and 1881. The Clantons were central figures in those conflicts, allied with certain interests, opposed to others, operating in a political environment where the line between law enforcement and criminal enterprise was genuinely unclear. In this reading, Guadalupe Canyon was not a random attack, but an episode in a larger conflict, its Apache attribution a convenient explanation that served multiple parties' interests, and that the territorial authorities, for their own reasons, chose not to examine too carefully. A third thread enters through the Mexican side of the equation. The cargo that the Guadalupe Canyon party was transporting, whatever its precise nature, had to come from somewhere. If it was Mexican silver or gold, it had a point of origin in Sonora, and that point of origin had its own interested parties. Mexican mining operations, land grant holders, the various factions competing for control of Sonoran resources in this period, had their own intelligence networks and their own capacity for violence. A party moving their product across the border without appropriate arrangements, appropriate meaning sanctioned by whoever controlled that particular corridor, was a party that had created enemies south of the line. Whether the attack came from north or south of the border, the gold, or silver, or whatever the cargo was, disappeared completely. It does not appear in any subsequent record. It was not recovered by the territorial investigation. It was not found at the attack site. The men who died in Guadalupe Canyon were buried there, their cargo unaccounted for, their killer or killers unidentified. The survivor's account is the only direct testimony from that night, and it is partial. A man hiding in brush in the pre-dawn dark, listening to violence he could not see, surviving by staying invisible. What he saw and heard was genuine. What it means, in the full context of what the men in that camp were doing and why they were there, is a question he either couldn't answer or chose not to. 3 months after the Guadalupe Canyon ambush, the Clanton family would be standing in a vacant lot in Tombstone as the most famous gunfight in Western history unfolded around them. Ike Clanton would survive. His brother Billy would not. The world's attention would go to Tombstone, to the Earps and Doc Holliday, to the 30 seconds of gunfire that became mythology. and Guadalupe Canyon, and the men who died there, and whatever they were carrying through that dark borderland corridor would recede into the background of a history that had already chosen its iconic moments. The canyon walls are still there, dark basalt holding the heat of the day long after the sun has moved on. The cottonwoods still mark the waterline along the canyon floor. The place where the camp was made that night is unmarked and largely unvisited, a location that appears in historical accounts with coordinates that most people have no reason to look up. But the gold, if it was gold, went somewhere. Everything goes somewhere. It was carried out of that canyon by people who had planned the taking of it, who knew its value, who had a destination in mind when they left the camp behind them in the darkness. And the question of where it went, who received it, how it was disposed of, whether it still exists in some form in some location connected to the networks that move through that borderland corridor, is a question that the canyon has never answered, and that the people who could have answered it took with them, one way or another, into their own silences. The gold that left Guadalupe Canyon in the hands of men who knew what they were taking has never been accounted for. It moved through the borderland dark and disappeared into whatever network received it, and the canyon kept the record of what it cost. 5 men dead, 1 survivor in the brush, a mourning that the history books filed under Apache raid and moved on from. The borderlands have a way of doing that, of absorbing events into the larger noise of a violent period, giving them a label that satisfies the administrative requirement without necessarily capturing the truth. Apache raid, desertion, accident. The labels close the files close the questions, and the questions, unasked, accumulate in the landscape like sediment, layer on layer, decade on decade, until the ground itself is made partly of what was never resolved. What comes next is from the same borderland country, the same general period, the same essential dynamic, men, mountains, and something valuable enough to kill for or die trying to find. But this story is different in one significant way. In Guadalupe Canyon, the men were real, and the gold was real, and the mystery is about what happened to both. What comes next is a mystery about men who may or may not have been real at all. The Chiricahua Mountains rise from the southeastern corner of Arizona in a mass of granite and rhyolite that feels, from a distance, almost improbable. A sky island lifting from the surrounding desert grasslands to elevations above 9,000 feet, dense with Douglas fir and Apache pine at the higher elevations, giving way to oak woodland and then grassland as the slopes descend. The rock formations in the Chiricahuas are extraordinary, columns and balanced rocks and spires carved by millions of years of erosion into shapes that the imagination fills with narrative. Cochise Head, the profile of the great Apache leader visible in a ridgeline, is the most famous of these formations. But the entire range has this quality of shaped stone, of geology that looks deliberate, as if the mountains themselves are trying to communicate something in a language just beyond comprehension. The Chiricahuas were the heartland of the Chiricahua Apache, the band led first by Cochise, then by figures including Geronimo, whose resistance to confinement on reservation land defined the final chapter of the Apache Wars. The mountains were known, protected, defended with a ferocity that the Army found tactically bewildering and that modern military historians have analyzed as some of the most effective guerrilla warfare ever conducted in North America. They were also, according to accounts that begin appearing in the 1870s and continue with remarkable persistence through the early 20th century, the location of mining activity that no one could fully explain. The accounts take a consistent form, which is itself worth noting. A traveler, a soldier, a prospector moving through the Chiricahua foothills or the lower canyon approaches report seeing men working. Not Apache, not cowboys or ranchers. Men engaged in what appears to be extractive labor, digging, moving rock, operating in the organized way of a mining operation. The witnesses observe them from a distance for varying periods of time. And then, through distraction, through the natural obstacles of the terrain, through the simple act of looking away and looking back, the men are gone, not fled, not departed in any observable direction. Simply absent, in the way that things in the Chiricahuas have a tendency to become absent. The earliest documented versions of these accounts come from Army personnel stationed at Fort Bowie, the post established in Apache Pass to control the water source that made the pass strategically critical. Soldiers on patrol in the mountain approaches reported the phenomenon often enough that it appears in the post records not as individual curiosities, but as a recognized category of observation. Men seen working at the mountain's edge, men who could not be located when approached. The Apache connection is the first and most obvious framework for understanding these accounts. The Chiricahua Apache had knowledge of the mountains that the Army, the settlers, and the prospectors emphatically did not. If there were mineral deposits in the Chiricahuas worth working, and the geology of the range, which sits within the same broadly mineralized belt that produced significant deposits elsewhere in southeastern Arizona, suggests there could be, the Apache would have known about them. And they would have had every reason to work them quietly, to maintain that knowledge within the community, and to ensure that the operation was never visible long enough to be investigated. Men seen at a distance, engaged in organized labor, who disappear when approached. This is entirely consistent with Apache miners operating in their own mountains, with the full tactical awareness that had made their resistance to the Army so effective for so long. The ability to be present without being findable was a survival skill the Chiricahua had developed to an extraordinary degree. But this explanation, satisfying as far as it goes, doesn't account for all of the accounts. Because the sightings don't stop with the Apache Wars. They continue after the final surrender of Geronimo in 1886. They continue after the forced removal of the Chiricahua Apache from Arizona. A removal so complete and so brutal that the entire band was transported to Florida, then Alabama, then Oklahoma, held as prisoners of war for 27 years before the survivors were given the choice of allotments in Oklahoma or land at the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. After 1886, there were no Chiricahua Apache in the Chiricahua Mountains. The mountains that bore their name were empty of the people who had defined them, and the phantom miners kept appearing. This continuation is the detail that separates the Chiricahua accounts from a straightforward explanation and places them in more uncertain territory. Prospectors in the 1890s reported it. Ranchers who moved into the valleys below the mountains after the Apache removal reported it. A small number of accounts from the early 20th century, gathered by researchers interested in the region's mining history, describe the same essential phenomenon. Organized activity at the mountain's edge, visible from a distance, gone when approached. Who these men were, after the removal of the Chiricahua, is a question the accounts don't answer. One possibility. Apache individuals or small groups who had not surrendered, who had remained in the mountains through the removal period and afterward, living in a concealment so complete that the Army's comprehensive effort to remove the entire band had missed them. This was not impossible. The Chiricahuas were large enough and complex enough in their terrain that small numbers of determined people could theoretically have remained hidden. There are accounts from the early reservation period of individuals who appeared at Mescalero claiming to have spent years in the Chiricahua wilderness after the removal. A second possibility, suggested by researchers who have examined the regional mining records in detail, involves non-Apache operators. Mexican mining families with pre-existing knowledge of deposits in the range, operating quietly in the period after the Apache removal, when the mountains were nominally accessible but still practically remote enough to allow undocumented activity. Mining operations that stayed off the official claim records for reasons that ranged from tax avoidance to something more protective. The kind of operation that needed to stay invisible because the knowledge it was working from was not knowledge its operators had any interest in sharing. A third possibility is harder to classify. Some of the accounts describe the phantom miners in terms that don't fit either Apache or Mexican miners in their physical description: clothing, equipment, the manner of their work. In ways that the witnesses found difficult to articulate, but consistently noted as wrong, as somehow not matching any category of person they could place in that landscape. These accounts are the least documented and the most easily dismissed. And yet they persist, like the others, across decades and witnesses with no apparent connection to one another, describing an experience in the same mountain range with enough consistency that simple coincidence becomes a less comfortable explanation the longer you look at it. The Chiricahua Mountains are a national monument now. The rock formations that Cochise's people knew as home are photographed by tourists who stand at the base of the columns and look up in the same bewilderment that the geology has always produced. The trails through Bonita Canyon and Echo Canyon are marked and maintained. The mountains are, in the contemporary sense, known. And yet the mining records for the range remain conspicuously thin relative to the geological potential. Significant deposits have been identified in the surrounding areas. The Chiricahuas themselves have yielded limited documented production. For a range of that size, in a region that was extensively prospected, this absence is either geological bad luck or something else. The question of what the phantom miners were working, whether they found what they were looking for, whether what they found is still there, whether the mountain's geological potential is as unrealized as the official record suggests, sits in the Chiricahuas the way all the best questions sit in this country. In plain sight. Just far enough away that when you move toward it directly with instruments and intention, it has a way of not being there anymore. The Chiricahua Mountains keep their distance from direct inquiry. Move toward what you think you saw, and the terrain rearranges itself around your approach. The phantom miners work at the edge of observation, always just far enough away that certainty stays out of reach. The geology suggests there should be more there than the record shows, and the record, characteristically, declines to explain the gap. It is a pattern that runs through this entire landscape like a vein through rock. The closer you look, the more the thing you're looking at seems to recede, not because it isn't there, but because the country between here and there is the kind of country that changes people's relationship with certainty. What comes next moves down from the mountains and into a valley, down from elevation and concealment into open riparian country, a river corridor that should, in principle, be more legible than the high ranges. More documented, more known, and in many ways, it is. The San Pedro River Valley is one of the most archaeologically rich corridors in North America, its history layered in ways that researchers have been working to document for well over a century. It is known country in the academic sense. And yet, the San Pedro River runs north through southeastern Arizona in a direction that seems, to anyone who knows the region's general drainage, slightly counterintuitive. Most water in this part of the world moves toward the Gulf of California. The San Pedro moves toward the Gila, threading through a valley between the Dragoon Mountains to the west and the Mule Mountains and their extensions to the east, passing through country that has been continuously inhabited for an almost incomprehensible span of time. Mammoths were killed along this river. The Clovis people, among the earliest documented human inhabitants of North America, left their tools in the gravels of the San Pedro at a site called Murray Springs, a kill site more than 13,000 years old, where the evidence of human hunters and their prey lies preserved in the alluvial deposits with a clarity that still astonishes the researchers who work there. The river has been a corridor for human movement and human life for longer than almost any other documented location in the Southwest. That depth of occupation means the San Pedro Valley holds accumulations of human activity and human loss that the relatively brief period of the frontier barely scratches the surface of. But it is the frontier period that concerns us here, specifically a series of accounts beginning in the 1850s and extending through the 1880s, describing treasure deposited in or near the San Pedro. Not in the mountains flanking it, but in the valley itself, along the river corridor, in locations described with a specificity that suggests direct knowledge rather than rumor. The accounts divide, roughly, into two categories that may or may not describe the same underlying reality. The first category involves Spanish colonial material, silver, processed at operations in the surrounding mountains, transported through the San Pedro Valley along routes that connected Sonoran mining districts to the north, cached along the river during periods when Apache pressure made continued movement impossible. This category of account is the most historically grounded. The San Pedro Valley was a known travel corridor in the Spanish colonial period. Apache raiding was a genuine and persistent threat to transport operations. The practice of caching valuable cargo during tactical retreats, with the intention of recovering it when conditions improved, is documented in colonial records across the Southwest. What is not documented in the San Pedro accounts is the recovery. The caches that were made, if they were made by people whose subsequent fates the record doesn't always track. Expeditions that turned back, operations that were abandoned, men who died before they could return for what they had left. The second category is more specific and more contested. It involves accounts circulating in the tombstone period of the early 1880s of significant quantities of silver bullion hidden in the San Pedro Valley in connection with the complex web of mining claims, smelter operations, and extra-legal commerce that defined the tombstone economy at its peak. Tombstone's silver boom was real and enormous. At its height, the mines under the town were producing millions of dollars of silver annually, and the infrastructure around that production involved a great deal of metal moving through the surrounding landscape in various states of processing and ownership. Not all of that metal moved through official channels. The borderlands economy of the period was thoroughly entangled with smuggling, claim manipulation, and the kind of financial creativity that the distance from regulatory oversight made possible. Silver that existed off the books needed to be stored somewhere. The San Pedro Valley, running between the mining district and the border, was an obvious corridor. Several accounts, gathered from participants and observers in the tombstone period and recorded in the years and decades that followed, describe specific locations along the river where significant quantities of silver were placed. Not abandoned, but stored with the expectation of recovery by people whose subsequent circumstances prevented them from completing the retrieval. The tombstone boom collapsed with the flooding of the mines in 1886. The people who had operated in the silver economy scattered, some to other mining districts, some into legitimate business, some into the various forms of obscurity that the frontier offered to men who preferred not to be found. The ones who knew where things were hidden along the San Pedro were among those who scattered. And the silver, if it was there, stayed. What makes the San Pedro accounts more credible than the average lost treasure story, and this is a modest claim, not an endorsement, is the physical nature of the river corridor itself. The San Pedro is a dynamic system. The river channel has shifted over the past century and a half, cutting new banks, depositing new gravels, burying old surfaces under meters of alluvial material. Locations that were accessible and identifiable in the 1880s may be physically transformed beyond recognition today. Not because anyone concealed them further, but because the river did what rivers do. Archaeological work along the San Pedro has repeatedly produced evidence of occupation and activity at depths that reflect this burial process. Sites that were surface features in historical times, now meters below grade. If material was deposited in or near the river corridor in the 1850s through 1880s, the intervening century and a half of fluvial activity may have done more to conceal it than any human effort could have. This is not romantic. It is hydrology, but it has the same practical effect as deliberate concealment. It makes recovery without precise coordinates, without the specific local knowledge that the original depositors had, genuinely and perhaps permanently difficult. There is a third thread in the San Pedro mystery that moves away from Spanish silver and tombstone bullion and into territory that the archaeological record introduces without quite explaining. The Hohokam and their predecessors moved through this valley for centuries before the Spanish arrived. The Sobaipuri, who were living in the San Pedro Valley when the Spanish first documented the region in the 17th century, described their own understanding of the valley's history in terms that suggested awareness of older occupation and older accumulation, a layered sense of what the valley had held and what it continued to hold beneath its surface. Some researchers who have worked in the region for extended periods describe a quality to the San Pedro Valley that the straightforward archaeological and historical record doesn't fully capture. A sense of density, of accumulation, that exceeds what the documented sites represent. The feeling, based on decades of fieldwork and pattern recognition, that the known sites are a fraction of what the valley contains, and that the gaps in the record are not gaps in the human activity, but gaps in the documentation of it. Whether that undocumented accumulation includes the specific caches described in the historical accounts, the Spanish silver, the tombstone bullion, or whether it represents something older and differently valuable is a question the river itself is not organized to answer. The San Pedro moves north through its Cottonwood Gallery, one of the last free-flowing rivers in the desert southwest, its banks thick with the vegetation that reliable water produces in dry country. The water is shallow and clear over gravel bars that have been rearranged by every flood season, the surface of a system that has been rearranging itself for longer than the concept of treasure has existed in this landscape. Somewhere beneath those gravels, beneath the alluvial layers that the river has built up across centuries, the things that were left along this corridor wait in whatever state time and water have left them. Not lost exactly. Location implies the perspective of someone looking, simply present in the way that things beneath rivers are present, below the surface, below the current, below the reach of anyone who doesn't know exactly, precisely where to put their hands. The San Pedro moves its gravel season by season, burying what the valley holds beneath the patient arithmetic of accumulating sediment. Whatever was placed along that corridor, Spanish silver, tombstone bullion, the older accumulations that predate the concept of treasure itself, rests now beneath layers that the river has added without consultation, without record, without any interest in the questions being asked from above. There is something almost philosophical about that. About a landscape that continues its own processes regardless of what human activity has deposited in it. The river doesn't know it's hiding anything. It is simply being a river. But what comes next is different. What comes next involves a mine that wasn't hidden by natural process. A mine that was found, worked, and then lost. Not to hydrology, not to time, but to the specific human dynamics of a boomtown that was growing faster than its record-keeping could manage, in country where the ground gave up silver with a generosity that made careful documentation feel, to the men doing the digging, like a luxury they could attend to later. Later, in Silver City, had a way of not arriving. Silver City sits in the foothills of the Pinos Altos Mountains in southwestern New Mexico, in a landscape that was already old with human use when the silver rush arrived in the early 1870s. The town grew with the particular velocity of a mining boomtown. Fast, loud, provisional, the kind of growth that builds infrastructure in the wrong order and assumes that the ground will keep producing long enough to fix whatever was done hastily at the start. Streets cut into the arroyos, buildings erected on land that the seasonal floods had opinions about, a community that in its first decade felt like a permanent city and in its second began to understand the terms of the bargain it had made with the landscape. The Big Ditch, the channel that now bisects historic Silver City where its main street used to run, carved by floods that the arroyo drainage couldn't contain, is the most visible evidence of that bargain. Where people walked and drove wagons and conducted business, there is now a 15-foot chasm. The landscape reclaimed the street so thoroughly that the town simply built around it and moved on. This capacity for dramatic alteration, for the ground to change its nature within a human lifetime, is the physical context for the Silver City Skeleton Mine mystery. The mine itself enters the historical record through a specific and documented event. In the early 1880s, during a period of active prospecting in the hills surrounding Silver City, a miner, the accounts give different names and none of them is verifiable with confidence, discovered a shaft. Not a new shaft, an old one. A working that predated his arrival and predated, by the evidence he found inside it, the American mining period entirely. The shaft was not deep by the standards of serious mining, but it was clearly constructed with intent and knowledge, timbered in sections, following a vein of silver ore that the discoverer described as exceptionally rich, worked to a point that suggested sustained operation rather than exploratory digging. The tools found inside it were not American. They were not the equipment of 1870s mining technology. They were older, consistent with the hand tool tradition of Spanish colonial mining, adze, wedges, the kind of instrumentation that the colonial period used before industrial methods arrived. And there were bones, human remains, found within the shaft in a position and context that suggested the people they had belonged to had died there. Not buried, not placed with any ceremony or intention that the discoverer could identify. Simply present, in the mine, in the way that people are present when they die in a place and no one comes to remove them. How many sets of remains the discoverer found is one of the details the accounts don't agree on. Some say 2, some say more. The condition of the bones, their state of preservation, their arrangement, any evidence of how those people died, was not recorded with the precision that would allow a modern forensic reconstruction. They were noted in the way that frontier miners noted things that were interesting but not immediately relevant to the question of the ore. The ore was the point, and by the discoverer's account, there was a great deal of it. What happened next is where the mystery acquires its essential shape. The discoverer, whoever he was, reported the find. He described the location, the shaft, the richness of the vein, the bones. He filed, or began to file, a claim. And then, within a period that the accounts measure variously as days or weeks, the mine became unfindable. Not collapsed, not deliberately concealed as far as anyone could determine. Simply located in a landscape that, when approached again with the intention of relocating it, did not produce the feature that had been found there before. This is not, on its face, impossible. The hills around Silver City in the early 1880s were being worked intensively, and the terrain was complex enough that landmarks shifted in significance as new workings altered the visual character of the hillsides. A man who found something in a hurry and returned without adequate directional notes was a man who might genuinely lose a location in that kind of environment. But several details complicate the simple explanation. The discoverer was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, an inexperienced prospector. He was a working miner with enough time in the region to know the hills with practical intimacy. The description he gave of the mine's location was specific enough that multiple subsequent searches, conducted by people with those descriptions in hand, should have been able to locate it. They couldn't. The searches continued, sporadically, across the following years. Other miners who had heard the account made their own attempts. Local historians in the early 20th century, compiling records of the Silver City District's mining history, noted the skeleton mine account and the subsequent failure to relocate it as a documented anomaly, something that had entered the record and then stopped being verifiable. The bones in these later accounts became the detail that attracted the most interpretive energy. The mainstream historical interpretation situates them within the pattern of Spanish colonial mining in the Southwest. Workers, possibly enslaved indigenous laborers, who died in a shaft and were left where they fell when the operation was abandoned. This was not uncommon. The labor conditions of colonial mining were brutal, the mortality rate significant, and the documentary impulse of the operators did not typically extend to recording the deaths of the people doing the actual digging. Bones in old Spanish shafts are not, in the regional archaeological context, a remarkable finding. But some researchers have noted that the specific location of Silver City sits in territory that the historical record of Spanish colonial mining doesn't strongly account for. The major documented Spanish operations in southwestern New Mexico were concentrated in different areas. A shaft in the Silver City hills worked to a significant depth, following a rich vein. This would represent a colonial operation of some substance, and an operation of that substance should have left at least a trace in the colonial records. It hasn't. Not one that researchers have found. This pushes the possible origin of the shaft in 2 directions. Either earlier than the Spanish colonial period, pre-contact mining activity conducted by peoples whose relationship with the mineral resources of the region predates European documentation entirely, or later, conducted by someone operating in the colonial period but outside the official structures that would have generated records. Both possibilities have their own implications for the bones. Pre-contact mining in the Southwest is documented at specific sites: turquoise mines, copper workings, places where indigenous peoples extracted materials for trade and ceremony across centuries. Silver mining is less well documented, but the absence of documentation is not evidence of absence in a region where systematic archaeological survey remains incomplete. If the bones in the Silver City shaft belonged to pre-contact miners, people working that vein long before the Spanish arrived, long before Silver City existed as a concept, their presence in the shaft represents a history of this landscape that the Boomtown era didn't know it was building on top of. And if the vein they were working was as rich as the discoverer described, the question of why that vein has never been relocated, never been developed, never appeared in the Silver City mining record in any form that connects to the original discovery, is a question the hills above the big ditch have declined, across a century and a half of working and reworking, to answer. The town goes on around its chasm. The hills above it bear the marks of a century of extraction, old tailings, collapsed portals, the gentle subsidence of ground that gave up what it held and settled into the space left behind. And somewhere in those hills, if the account is accurate, and the geography of the place has not transformed it beyond recovery, a shaft goes down into old rock, following a vein that someone found valuable enough to die for. With the bones of those people still there, still waiting to be found again, and this time, for someone to ask the right questions about who they were. The bones in the Silver City hills wait in their shaft, in whatever darkness old rock preserves, for a finder who brings the right questions with them. The vein runs somewhere beneath the altered terrain of a century of extraction, present in the geology regardless of whether the human record can locate it. The ground keeps what it keeps, indifferent to the searches conducted above it. There is a particular quality to places that have been worked over and over, mined, surveyed, mapped, searched, and still retain a secret at their center. The Silver City hills have that quality. So do the Chiricahuas, the Mimbres, the San Andres. Mountains that have been walked across by thousands of people across hundreds of years and still produce occasionally something that the accumulated searching hadn't found. The mystery that comes next is different in texture. It isn't underground. It isn't hidden in rock or buried by river sediment or concealed in the geometry of a vein that the surface doesn't reveal. What vanished in the Animas Valley was above ground, visible, documented. It had walls and fences and the infrastructure of a working life. It had people in it. And then, in a way that the available record has never adequately explained, it didn't. The Animas Valley runs north to south through the extreme southwestern corner of New Mexico in the narrow strip of state that extends below Arizona's southern border. The Boot Heel, as it's called, a geographical anomaly created by the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 that gave New Mexico a protrusion of territory pointing south toward Mexico. The valley itself is wide and flat-bottomed, bounded by the Animas Mountains to the east and the lower Pelanchillo Range to the west, drained by the Animas Creek in its upper reaches and opening into broader desert basin country as it approaches the Mexican border. It is cattle country, has been since the open range period of the 1880s, when the combination of reliable grass and relative inaccessibility made it attractive to ranching operations that needed space and preferred limited oversight. The valley receives enough summer monsoon rain to support grazing, the mountains provide water catchment, and the distances from territorial administration meant that the particular kind of independent, self-sufficient operation that the frontier produced could function here with minimal interference. Several ranching families established themselves in the Animas Valley in the 1880s. They built structures, dug wells, ran cattle across ranges that they had staked out through the informal processes of frontier land use, presence, improvement, the establishment of recognizable boundaries. Some of these operations became the foundation of ranches that persist, in various forms to the present day. One did not. The ranch in question enters the historical record through a specific set of documents: land survey records, a partial cattle brand registration, references in the correspondence of a neighboring operation, and a single mention in a territorial newspaper from the late 1880s describing it as a going concern, a productive outfit, the kind of understated language that newspapers used for operations that were functioning without drama. And then it stops appearing in the record. Not through any documented event, not through a sale, a foreclosure, an abandonment noted in any legal or administrative filing. Not through a death recorded in the territorial records, or a removal, or any of the ordinary mechanisms by which a working ranch ceased to be a working ranch and became something else. It simply stops being mentioned. The land it occupied shows up in subsequent surveys as unimproved. The brand disappears from the regional cattle records without the notation of transfer that was customary when an operation changed hands. The people associated with it, a small number of named individuals, the count varying across the different documents that mention the ranch, are not traceable in subsequent records elsewhere. The neighboring operation, whose correspondence references the ranch notes in a letter from the early 1890s, that the place had been empty for some time and that the writer had no information about what had become of its occupants. The tone is matter of fact. The frontier absorbed disappearances without excessive ceremony, but the specificity of the observation establishes that the absence was noticed, that it was considered notable enough to mention, and that the writer, who was well positioned to know the valley's business, had no explanation. That absence of explanation from someone who was there is the most significant piece of evidence the record contains. The conventional framework for understanding ranch disappearances in the Animas Valley during this period is Apache raiding, specifically the periods of intense conflict during the Geronimo campaigns of the mid-1880s, when Chiricahua Apache moving between the Sierra Madre in Mexico and the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico passed through exactly this corridor with regularity, and when isolated ranching operations in the Boot Heel country were genuinely and significantly vulnerable. Several operations in the region were destroyed or abandoned during this period, their occupants killed or driven out, and the subsequent recovery of some of those operations produced no mystery because the cause was documented and the aftermath was recorded. The timing of the Animas Ranch disappearance sits at the edge of this framework, late enough that the Apache raiding explanation is possible, early enough that its absence from the documented record of that conflict is notable. The Geronimo campaigns generated substantial Army documentation of raids and their consequences. An operation destroyed in that context would typically appear somewhere in that record, in patrol reports, in claims for compensation, in the accounts of scouts and civilians that the Army collected. It doesn't. This absence doesn't rule out raiding as a cause. The documentation of the Apache campaigns was thorough, but not complete, and operations in the most remote corners of the Boot Heel were the most likely to fall through the administrative gaps. But it leaves the question open in a way that the straightforward explanation doesn't fully close. A second possibility, suggested by researchers who have examined the land tenure history of the Animas Valley in detail, involves the complex and frequently extra-legal processes by which land in the Boot Heel changed hands during the 1880s and 1890s. Large cattle operations, some backed by Eastern or foreign capital, some controlled by figures with political connections that gave them access to legal mechanisms unavailable to small operators, were consolidating range across the Southwest during this period, and the methods used to encourage small operations to vacate were not always recorded in a way that acknowledged their true nature. A ranch that disappeared without documentation could have been purchased under duress, could have been driven out by the manipulation of water rights, the destruction of fences, the application of the kind of pressure that left no paper trail because it was designed not to. The people who left under those circumstances often had reasons not to publicize their departure, and the operations that absorbed their range had reasons not to publicize the mechanism of acquisition. In this reading, the Animas Ranch's disappearance is not a mystery of violence or misfortune, but a mystery of deliberate erasure. A small operation removed from the landscape by interests that were larger, better connected, and more practiced at making things disappear cleanly. There's a third thread that the Animas Valley itself introduces, and that belongs to a category of observation that the documentary record is not designed to accommodate. People who have spent extended time in the Boot Heel country, ranchers, hunters, the occasional researcher, describe the Animas Valley as a place with a quality of presence that exceeds its current population. Not in the supernatural register exactly, but in the way that landscapes with long and complicated histories sometimes carry that history in their physical character. The valley holds its silence differently than empty country usually does. It has, in the accounts of people who know it well, the feeling of a place where more happened than the visible record shows. Whether that quality is the product of genuine perceptual sensitivity to historical accumulation, or simply the psychological effect of knowing that the history is incomplete, is a question that doesn't resolve cleanly in either direction. What it points toward is the same thing the documentary gaps point toward: a valley that absorbed more than it returned to the record. That took people and structures and working lives into its wide, flat basin and gave back, in the official accounting, less than what went in. The Animas mountains catch the morning light on their eastern faces, the color shifting from gray to gold to the warm rust of oxidized rock as the sun climbs. The valley floor below them is grass and scrub, and the occasional windmill marking a water source, the infrastructure of a cattle economy that has persisted in various forms for a century and a half. The specific parcel where the vanished ranch stood, if it can be identified at all from the fragmentary survey records, shows nothing now that marks it as different from the surrounding land. No foundation, no well casing, no fence post rotted to a stump. Nothing that says people were here, built something here, lived here, until they didn't. Just the valley, just the grass, just the mountains holding the light the way they always have, and the question of what the boot heel country took, and whether it took it gently or otherwise. Open, still, in the wide silence of a valley that has never offered a full accounting of itself. The Animas Valley keeps its silence the way wide-open country does, not with the concentrated darkness of a canyon or the vertical authority of a mountain, but with the simple, enormous patience of flat land under a large sky. What went into that valley and didn't come back out stayed gone without drama, without the kind of geographic violence that explains disappearance in more dramatic terrain. The land just held it, quietly, without acknowledgement. There is a version of the frontier that looks like that, gradual, administrative, the kind of erasure that happens through paperwork not filed, and records not kept, and people not looked for. Small operations swallowed by larger ones. Lives that the official record never found important enough to follow. But there is another version. Faster, more deliberate. The kind of disappearance that involves specific people, a specific sum, a specific moment when something that was carefully tracked and officially accounted for simply stopped being where it was supposed to be. That version leaves a different kind of silence. Sharper, more institutional. The silence not of a valley that absorbed something passively, but of a system that lost something it was designed to protect and could never fully explain how. Fort Apache sits in the White Mountains of east-central Arizona, on a plateau above the White River, where the Ponderosa pine forest meets the canyon country dropping toward the Salt River Basin. The setting is genuinely striking. The elevation brings cool air and the smell of pine to country that at lower elevations is pure desert, and the river below the fort's position catches the light in the mornings in long silver flashes through the trees. The fort was established in 1870, built to project military presence into the heart of White Mountain Apache territory, and it occupied that position. Simultaneously, military installation, administrative center, and uneasy neighbor to the Apache communities it was supposed to control, through the remainder of the Apache Wars period and beyond. The White Mountain Apache were, in the calculus of the Army's Arizona strategy, a complicated element. Some bands allied with the military against the Chiricahua. The Apache scouts who served under commanders including Al Sieber were among the most effective military auxiliaries in the Army's history, their knowledge of the terrain and their tactical skill providing capabilities that no amount of conventional military training could replicate. The relationship between Fort Apache and the surrounding Apache communities was therefore neither straightforwardly hostile nor straightforwardly cooperative. It was layered, contingent, shot through with the specific tensions of a situation where the people being administered had more knowledge of the land than the administrators, and where the administrators had the institutional power. Into this setting, in the late 1870s or early 1880s, the accounts are not precise about the date, which is itself a telling detail. A payroll shipment disappeared. The payroll, was Army money. Coin in the amounts that the period required to pay a garrisoned force. Not a trivial sum, but not an extraordinary one by the standards of military logistics. It was being transported to Fort Apache from a supply depot, following one of the established routes through the White Mountain country, accompanied by a small escort as was standard for transfers of this kind. It didn't arrive. The official response to the disappearance was, by the surviving records, oddly muted. An inquiry was conducted, as Army regulations required. The inquiry produced a finding. The accounts disagree on what that finding was, which is itself an anomaly in a system that was supposed to generate clear documentation. And the matter was, officially, resolved without recovery of the funds. That resolution, without recovery and without a clear explanation of what had happened, is the center of the Fort Apache payroll mystery. The range of explanations that the inquiry apparently considered. And the records here are frustratingly incomplete, either through genuine loss or through the kind of selective preservation that bureaucracies practice when the full record is embarrassing, includes the expected categories. Ambush by hostile Apache. Robbery by non-Apache parties operating in the White Mountain country. Internal theft by members of the escort. And in at least one version of the account that circulates in the regional historical literature, something more unusual. A deliberate misdirection, a staged disappearance orchestrated by parties with foreknowledge of the shipment and access to the logistical details that would allow an interception to be planned. That last possibility is the one that the documentary record, such as it is, cannot rule out. Military payroll in the frontier period was not a secret operation. The schedules were known, had to be known, by a range of people at multiple posts and supply points. The route a payroll would travel from a given depot to a given fort was predictable, constrained by the practical geography of available roads and water sources. Anyone with institutional access to the Army's logistical arrangements in Arizona territory had, in principle, the information needed to intercept a shipment with foreknowledge rather than opportunism. The question of who had that access, and who among those people had both the motive and the operational capacity to act on it, opens onto the full landscape of corruption and ambition that characterized territorial Arizona in this period. The contracting system that supplied frontier forts was one of the most reliably corrupt features of the post-Civil War Army's Western operations. Contractors who supplied beef, grain, and goods to Arizona posts enriched themselves through a combination of short waits, substituted quality, and outright fraud that the Army's inspection systems were chronically unable to prevent. The men who operated these contracts were not frontier outlaws in the romantic sense. They were businessmen with political connections, operating in a zone where regulatory oversight was thin, and the profits from feeding and supplying a garrisoned army were substantial. A payroll that disappeared cleanly, without a body count, without the kind of physical aftermath that a genuine ambush produced, fits the operational signature of this world better than it fits the signature of an Apache raid. Raids left evidence. Contractors who had arranged a disappearance had every incentive to leave nothing at all. Whether the Fort Apache payroll was the product of this kind of inside arrangement is a question the surviving records cannot answer. The inquiry, whatever it found, produced a resolution that closed the file without explanation. The money was not recovered. No one was charged. The garrison was paid from other funds, and the incident receded into the administrative background of a post that had larger concerns. But the money itself, coin, physical and specific, went somewhere. Everything goes somewhere. The country between the supply depot and Fort Apache is complex. White Mountain terrain that the Apache scouts knew intimately and that the Army's logistical routes had worn into the landscape by years of use. If the payroll was taken and moved, it was moved through that country by people who knew how to move through it without leaving a recoverable trace. Some accounts, gathered from the edges of the historical record, from the families of Apache scouts who served at Fort Apache, from the long memory of the White Mountain Apache communities that have occupied this country continuously, suggest that the money's fate was known to certain people in the period immediately after the disappearance. Not broadly known. known in the way that things are known in small communities where information moves through relationships rather than documents, partially, indirectly, with the specific gaps that appear when people know more than they are willing to say to outside inquirers. What those accounts suggest the money's fate was, whether it was recovered by the people who took it and dispersed, or whether it remained in some form in the White Mountain country, is not something the accounts make explicit. They suggest knowledge without providing it. They indicate that the official finding was incomplete without specifying what was left out. This is, by now, a familiar pattern in this landscape. The official record closes. The community memory holds something different, something more, something that was never offered to the system that had already demonstrated its capacity for the kind of resolution that serves institutional interests rather than truth. The White River catches the morning light below the fort's plateau, silver in the pines, moving toward the canyon country as it always has. The fort itself is a historic site now. The original log buildings preserved, the parade ground maintained, the whole complex a monument to a period of history that the White Mountain Apache community has its own complex relationship with. The payroll that didn't arrive is a footnote in that history, a line in the ledger that never resolved. But somewhere in the White Mountain country, in the terrain between the route the shipment was supposed to travel and wherever it actually went, the coin that the army lost and never found followed its own path. Into the landscape, into the hands of whoever received it, into whatever became of those hands and that money across the century and a half since. The White Mountains keep what they keep, and the question of whether the payroll is still there, in some form, in some location connected to the network that absorbed it, is one the mountains have never seen fit to answer.